Throughout history, the Vatican has confronted countless tales of evil, but few inspired as much dread as the legend of the Wendigo. Unlike the devil, an entity bound within Christian theology, the Wendigo emerged from the depths of indigenous folklore, representing insatiable hunger, cannibalism, and the corruption of the human soul. To the Vatican, this creature symbolized a horror beyond ordinary demonic possession, a transformation born from human sin itself. The fear lay not only in the Wendigo's monstrous nature, but in its reflection of mankind's own potential for moral decay, proof that the greatest evil could come from within, not below. There are texts in the Vatican archives that should only be read during daylight hours and never alone. My name is Elena Torini, and I've been a cataloger for the Apostolic Archive for 9 years. My work is precise and solitary. I spend my days in climate-controlled rooms beneath the Vatican, documenting manuscripts that most scholars will never see. I read Latin and medieval Italian, some Greek, enough Aramaic to recognize scriptural references. I understand the difference between devotional literature and hagiography, between miracle accounts and fever dreams recorded by isolated mystics. I thought I understood the boundary between faith and obsession. In January of 2025, I was assigned to Section 7 of the Restricted Archives, 17th century religious writings, flagged for historical review, but never fully catalogued. The section occupied a narrow room with a single desk, a lamp, and 3 locked cabinets containing approximately 200 documents. My supervisor, Monsignor Baldini, gave me the cabinet keys and a standard instruction: document each text's contents, physical condition, and archival status. Flag anything requiring conservation or theological review. Work efficiently, he said, his hand resting briefly on the cabinet, marked with a faded red seal. Some of these texts have been waiting a long time. I began systematically, as I always do. Account books from a Franciscan monastery, letters between cardinals, debating papal succession, a collection of prayers copied by nuns in Florence. Standard archival material requiring attention, but not urgency. On the 4th day, I opened a leather portfolio tied with string that had calcified with age. Inside was a journal, perhaps 80 pages, written in a tight, elegant hand. The ink had faded to brown, but the script was clear, Italian, with occasional Latin phrases. No author's name on the first page, but a date, 1647. And a title that made me pause: The Miraculous Sustenance of Sister Caterina of the Perpetual Adoration. I'd heard of hunger saints before, medieval women who claimed to survive on the Eucharist alone, eating nothing else for years. The phenomenon was well documented, though the Church had always been cautious about endorsing such claims. Holiness or hysteria, miracle or mania, the line was never clear. This journal was different. It wasn't written by Sister Caterina, but about her, a priest's account, methodical and disturbing in its detail. He described how Sister Caterina had stopped eating food in 1607 after a vision during Mass. For 40 years, she consumed only the consecrated host at daily communion. The priest documented her weight, her vital signs as understood in that era, the color of her skin and eyes. He recorded the skepticism of bishops who tested her, locked her in rooms for weeks to prove she was sneaking food. She never was. But what unsettled me wasn't the fasting itself. It was what the priest wrote about her behavior, how she would wake at night and be found kneeling before the tabernacle, her hands pressed against the locked door, weeping. How she spoke of hunger, not for food, but for something else, something the host contained, but could not satisfy. The priest used the word transubstantiation repeatedly, circling it obsessively, as if the theological concept itself was the key to understanding her condition. On the final page, the entry stopped abruptly. A single line, dated 1647, Sister Katerina was found this morning before the altar. The tabernacle was open. Father Provincial has ordered her removal to the enclosed chapel. I am forbidden to visit her. God have mercy on us all. I photographed each page for the archive file, then wrote my summary. Historical interest, theological caution advised. Recommend consultation with the Congregation for the Causes of Saints. I tied the portfolio closed and placed it in the conservation box. That night, I woke at 3:17 in the morning. I know the time exactly because I looked at my phone, confused by the taste in my mouth, copper and something cold, like snow or metal. I went to the bathroom and rinsed my mouth, but the taste remained. It took an hour to fall back asleep. The next day, I continued cataloging, but my thoughts kept returning to Sister Katerina's journal. During lunch, I retrieved it from the conservation box and reread the priest's accounts. The descriptions of her hunger, the way she pressed her hands against the tabernacle door. There was a passage I'd missed the first time. She says the host is a doorway, but that she cannot pass through. She says she tastes what lies beyond, but cannot reach it. She begs me to help her, but I do not understand what she is asking. That night, I woke at 3:17 again. The taste was stronger, definitely copper, with that strange cold edge. But this time, I wasn't in my bed. I was standing in my apartment's small living room, facing the east wall, just standing there in my nightgown, my hands raised slightly, palms forward, as if I were pressing against something that wasn't there. I had no memory of getting up, no memory of walking from my bedroom. I called in sick the next day. I told myself it was stress, perhaps a sleepwalking episode, triggered by the unusual work in Section 7. I'd read disturbing material before, accounts of exorcisms, descriptions of stigmata, confessions from condemned heretics. I'd never brought it home with me like this. But I couldn't stop thinking about the journal, about Sister Katerina's 40 years of hunger, about what she'd been trying to reach through the tabernacle door. I returned to work on Monday. Monsignor Baldini asked if I was well, and I assured him I was. I avoided Section 7 for 2 days, working instead on correspondence from the 18th century. Safe, bureaucratic documents about church politics and property disputes. But on Wednesday, I went back. I told myself I needed to complete my catalog entry to add a more detailed summary of the journal's contents. I opened the portfolio and read the entire text again, slowly this time, taking notes on the priest's observations. He'd written that Sister Katerina's condition worsened in her final months. She stopped sleeping. She would kneel for hours before the tabernacle, not praying but listening. She says she hears it breathing, the priest wrote. She says the bread is alive in there, waiting. I have consulted with the bishop, but he forbids me to speak of this to anyone. He says I am too close to the situation, that I am beginning to share in her delusion. The final dated entry. 3 days before the journal ended, I found her with her mouth pressed against the tabernacle keyhole. Her lips were bleeding. She says she was trying to taste the air inside. God forgive me. I believe I understand what she means. I worked late that night, finishing the catalog entry. The archive was empty. The other catalogers gone by 6. I liked the quiet, the way my lamp created a small circle of light in the vast darkness of section 7. I photographed the final pages, closed the portfolio, and placed it back in the conservation box. Then I went to the archive's small chapel, a side room where staff could pray privately. There was a simple altar, a crucifix, and a wooden tabernacle no larger than a shoebox. I'd been inside this chapel dozens of times over the years, usually just to sit quietly during lunch to rest my eyes from manuscript work. I knelt before the altar. I told myself I was simply praying, decompressing, after days of disturbing material. But I found myself staring at the tabernacle, at its small locked door, wondering what it would feel like to press my hands against it, to press my mouth to the keyhole like Sister Katerina had done. The thought horrified me. I left immediately, gathered my things, and went home. That night, I woke at 3:17. I was not in my apartment. I was standing in the Vatican Archives chapel, before the altar, in my nightgown and bare feet. My hands were pressed against the tabernacle door, fingers spread wide. My mouth tasted of copper and snow and something else, something sweet and terrible that I have no words for. I had no memory of leaving my apartment. No memory of walking through Rome's winter streets, of entering the Vatican, of navigating the archive's locked corridors. But here I was, and the taste in my mouth was overwhelming, flooding my senses with a hunger I'd never known I could feel. The tabernacle was locked, but I could feel warmth behind the wooden door. Not metaphorical warmth, actual heat, like something living. Like breath. I don't know how long I stood there, minutes or hours. Time felt suspended, irrelevant. I only know that eventually I heard footsteps in the corridor outside. Security making rounds. The sound broke whatever held me, and I stumbled backward, my hands leaving damp prints on the tabernacle door. I hid in the shadows until the guard passed, then slipped out through the archive's back entrance. The winter air shocked my bare feet, grounded me. I walked home through empty streets, arrived just before dawn, and stood in my shower until the water ran cold. I didn't go to work the next day, or the day after. I called Monsignor Baldini and requested a transfer to a different section. I said section 7 was affecting my sleep, which was true enough. He approved without question. I'd worked there long enough to have earned trust, and perhaps he'd seen this before with other catalogers. But before I left section 7 permanently, I returned one final time. I needed to add a note to Sister Katerina's catalog entry, a warning for whoever worked with this material next. When I opened the conservation box, the portfolio was untied. I knew I'd tied it securely. I always did. But the string lay loose, and the journal was open to the final page, to that abrupt ending. The tabernacle was open. Beneath it, in fresh ink, impossible, because no one else had accessed this material, was a new line of text, the same elegant hand as the rest of the journal, but the ink was wet, dark red instead of brown. It said, "She found what she was looking for. So will you." I closed the portfolio immediately. I retied it with shaking hands, sealed the conservation box, and marked it with a red stamp. Restricted, theological review required. Then I wrote a memo to Monsignor Baldini, recommending the text be moved to the secret archive's deepest level, the section that requires 2 cardinals' permission to access. He approved the transfer without reading my full report. 2 days later, the portfolio was gone from section 7. I've been transferred to the main reading room now, where I help researchers access approved materials. Safe work, public work, but I still wake sometimes at 3:17 in the morning with that taste in my mouth, copper and snow and sweetness, and I still find myself standing, hands raised, facing east toward the Vatican. I haven't gone to the chapel again. I don't know if I could stop myself from opening the tabernacle if I did. Sister Caterina lasted 40 years. I wonder how long I have. There are texts in the Vatican archives that hunger for readers, and sometimes, God help us, we hunger back. The Vatican keeps certain documents in translation perpetually, cycling them through linguists who are never told why the work must continue, but never be completed. My name is Father Basil Curry, and I've served as a translator in the secret archives for 7 years. My specialty is 17th century French, specifically the missionary correspondence from New France, what we now call Quebec. These letters, written by Jesuit priests in remote outposts, document their conversion efforts among indigenous peoples. Most are routine, reports of baptisms, descriptions of harsh winters, requests for supplies and additional priests. The work is solitary and meditative. I sit in a climate-controlled vault, 3 levels below the Cortile della Pina, surrounded by acid-free boxes and the smell of old vellum, a single desk lamp, silence, except for the whisper of turning pages. I translate perhaps 5 letters per day, typing my work into a secure terminal that has no internet connection. At the end of each session, I print 1 copy for the archives and shred my notes. Standard protocol for historical documents. In June of 2024, I began a new collection. Letters from a mission station called Sainte Marie des Hurons, dated between 1639 and 1649. The box was marked with a red seal I hadn't seen before. A simple notation. Complete translation required. Consult prefect before circulation. The first letters were ordinary. Father Jacques Moreau wrote about constructing a chapel, about the difficulty of learning the Wendat language, about his hope that the word would take root in this new soil. His handwriting was careful and educated, his French eloquent despite the rough conditions he described. The 4th letter contained the first reference. Father Antoine has begun to exhibit signs, Moreau wrote. We have implemented the Wendigo protocol as instructed in our briefing from Quebec. He takes his meals separately now and does not say Mass. We pray it is merely winter sickness, but Brother Paul insists the signs are unmistakable. Father Antoine's shadow falls wrong in firelight. I read the passage 3 times. Wendigo protocol wasn't a term I recognized from Jesuit literature. I assumed it was some kind of illness response, perhaps a quarantine procedure for priests, showing signs of disease or mental distress brought on by isolation. I made a note to ask the prefect and continued translating. The references appeared in subsequent letters with increasing frequency, always the same phrase, Wendigo protocol. Father Moreau would mention it matter-of-factly, the way one might reference any established procedure. Father Louis, now under Wendigo protocol, day 6, no improvement, considering options. Or, we lost Father Antoine on the 14th. The protocol was followed correctly, but the recognition came too late. Lost, not died. Lost. By the 8th letter, I'd compiled a list of observations Moreau made about priests under protocol. They stopped casting shadows correctly. They would forget prayers they'd known since childhood, but only specific prayers, always the same ones. They became unable to touch certain objects, rosaries, consecrated hosts, water that had been blessed, and they exhibited what Moreau called the hunger that isn't hunger, a fixation on watching others eat, though they themselves would refuse all food except raw meat. The letters never explained what a Wendigo was. The term was used as if the reader already understood, as if there had been, as Moreau mentioned, a briefing from Quebec. I worked through the collection for 3 weeks. 27 letters in total. By the final letters, dated winter of 1649, only Father Moreau remained at the mission station. 6 other priests had been lost or sent back under unclear circumstances. Moreau's handwriting had deteriorated, the letters shorter and more cryptic. I performed the test each morning, he wrote in his second-to-last letter. I recite the specified verses before a mirror. I examine my shadow at noon. So far I remain myself. But I wonder now if that's something a man can know with certainty. If the change comes from within, would I recognize it? Or would I simply become convinced that everyone else had changed, that I alone remained true? His final letter was a single paragraph. This will be my last correspondence. I no longer trust my own observations. I have sealed the complete protocol instructions and am sending them to Rome with Brother Paul, who will return on the spring boats. May they be archived and remembered. May those who come after us be warned. Some missions require sacrifices we are not prepared to make, transformations we cannot recognize until they are complete. The letter was dated March 12, 1649. According to historical records, the Sainte Marie des Hurons mission was abandoned that same month. No explanation was ever recorded. I typed my translation of that final letter on a Tuesday afternoon. When I finished, I noticed there was one more item in the box, a separate envelope, heavier than the others, sealed with black wax, bearing no insignia. The cataloging slip attached to it read, untranslated. Sealed correspondence. Do not open without prefect authorization. The envelope was addressed in handwriting I now recognized as Father Moreau's, but the name on it made my hands go cold. Father Basil Curry, Vatican Secret Archives. My name. My exact title. I turned the envelope over carefully. On the reverse, below the black wax seal, was a date written in what appeared to be fresh ink, though that was impossible. The paper was nearly 400 years old. The date was September 15th, 2024. 3 months from the day I held it. I sat very still. The archive vault suddenly felt smaller, the shadows between the shelves deeper. I'd been alone down here for hours, my usual practice, but now I became aware of how isolated I was. 3 levels of stone and steel between me and the nearest occupied office. I didn't open the letter. Instead, I gathered all my translations and the unopened envelope and took them to Monsignor De Luca, the prefect of the archives. I found him in his office just after 6, preparing to leave for the evening. He listened to my explanation without interruption, his face neutral. When I finished, he held out his hand for the envelope. He examined it carefully, front and back, testing the weight of it. You've done excellent work, Father Curry, he said. Your translations are thorough and precise. Monsignor, the date is of course impossible, he finished. Paper doesn't write itself. Ink doesn't remain fresh for centuries. He placed the envelope in his desk drawer and locked it, which is why we have protocols for such anomalies. The Wendigo Protocol. I asked. Something shifted in his expression, not surprise, but a kind of resigned acknowledgement. Among others, the Church has been sending priests into difficult territories for 2 millennia, Father. We've learned that isolation and spiritual warfare can take forms that seem supernatural but are simply poorly understood. Hysteria, shared delusion, the human mind under extreme duress, and the letter addressed to me. A coincidence. Perhaps a joke by an archivist decades ago, or a misfiling, the name added later, in different ink, which appears fresh only because it's been protected from light. He stood, signaling the conversation was over. You've completed the translation work. I'll note that in your record. Take the rest of the week for prayer and reflection. Return Monday, and we'll assign you a new collection. I wanted to argue, to demand better explanations, but Monsignor De Luca's tone carried the weight of ecclesial authority, polite, absolute, final. I left his office. I took the rest of the week, as instructed. I tried to pray, but found myself distracted by questions I couldn't answer. At 3:17 each morning, I woke with the certainty that I'd forgotten something essential, some prayer or verse I'd known since seminary, but could no longer recall. On Monday, I returned to the archives. My desk had been cleared. A new collection waited for me. 18th century correspondence from Jesuit missions in Paraguay. Routine work. Nothing unusual. The envelope with black wax was never mentioned again, but I've begun performing small tests, though I'm not entirely sure why. Each morning, I recite specific psalms before the bathroom mirror. I watch my shadow as I walk through the Cortil della Pina at noon, checking that it falls the same direction as everyone else's. I touch my rosary frequently, making sure the beads don't burn my fingers. 3 weeks ago, I had lunch with Father Emmanuel, another translator. He mentioned casually that he'd been working on 17th century letters from New France. Routine missionary stuff, he said, though there's one odd collection that's been in circulation for decades, never completed. They just keep reassigning it. I asked which mission station. Sainte Marie des Hurons, he said. Last week, Monsignor De Luca stopped me in the corridor. He looked older than I remembered, tired. How were the Paraguay letters, Father Curry? He asked. Progressing well, Monsignor. He studied me for a long moment. Good, very good. And you're feeling well, sleeping properly. No unusual dreams or disturbances. No, Monsignor. He nodded slowly. Then he said something that I think about every day. The work we do here, Father. It requires us to read things that were never meant to be read, translate things that should perhaps remain in their original languages. Some knowledge is dangerous, not because it's false, but because understanding, it changes the understander. Do you follow? I said I did, though I wasn't certain. September 15th, he said. That's this coming Sunday. If you experience anything unusual, anything at all, you'll inform me immediately. This is not a request. It's Thursday now. 3 days until the date written on that envelope. I've been watching myself carefully, looking for signs of whatever Father Moreau feared. But here's what troubles me most. I can no longer remember what the specific prayers were that priests under the Wendigo protocol could not recite. I wrote them in my notes. I'm certain of it, but those notes were shredded, as per protocol. And I'm starting to suspect that forgetting is itself one of the signs. There are objects in the Vatican that should never be weighed twice. My name is Marco Van, and for 8 years I've cataloged and restored sacred objects in the Vatican's reserve collection. The items too fragile, too controversial, or too unusual for public display. It's careful work, done in climate-controlled rooms beneath the Apostolic Palace, recording provenance and condition for objects that sometimes haven't been examined since the 17th century. I've handled splinters said to be from the true cross, phials of saints' blood that liquefy on certain feast days, and manuscripts written in languages no scholar can identify. The Church keeps careful records of these things. Someone must. In September of 2024, I was assigned to catalog the reliquaries in Storage Room 7, a subterranean chamber that required 3 separate keys and a written request form filed 72 hours in advance. The room contained approximately 200 reliquaries, mostly from the medieval period, each housing bone fragments or cloth scraps from various saints. Standard procedure: photograph each item, record dimensions and weight, note any deterioration, update the database. I worked alone, as I preferred. The room was silent, except for the hum of climate control and the soft scrape of my gloved hands against metal and wood. The reliquaries were beautiful in their way: ornate silver caskets, crystal cylinders, wooden boxes bound in copper, each one labeled in fading Latin script, identifying the saint and the body part contained within. The iron box was unremarkable compared to the others. Perhaps 20 centimeters long, 10 wide, 5 deep. No ornamentation, just plain black iron with a simple latch. The label was nearly illegible: Sanctus Theophilus, Digitus, Anno Domini MCX. Saint Theophilus, finger, year of our Lord, 1114. I'd never heard of this particular saint, but there were thousands of minor saints whose cults had faded over the centuries. I photographed it, measured it, then placed it on my digital scale. 4.7 kilograms. I recorded the weight, then opened the latch to examine the contents. Inside, wrapped in ancient linen, was a single finger bone, yellowed with age, but remarkably preserved. Beneath it, folded carefully, was a piece of parchment with handwriting in medieval Latin. The note read, "Non permit ut te isurientem videat." Do not let it see you hungry. I've cataloged hundreds of reliquaries. Many came with notes, instructions for handling, prayers to recite, feast days to commemorate. But this phrasing was unusual, ominous, even. I photographed the note, returned everything to the box, and moved on to the next item. But that evening, as I prepared to leave, I decided to weigh the iron box again, just to verify my earlier measurement. Sometimes the scales needed calibration, and accuracy was essential for our records. I placed it on the scale alone, after everyone else had left for the day. 6.2 kilograms. I stared at the reading, 1.5 kilograms heavier than 6 hours earlier. I checked the scale's calibration. Perfect. I weighed other items. They all matched their earlier measurements. Just the iron box had changed. I told myself it was a mistake. I'd misread the first measurement or written it down wrong. These things happened. I corrected my notes and went home. That night, I made dinner, pasta with olive oil and garlic, a simple meal I'd made 1,000 times. But when I sat down to eat, I found I wasn't hungry. The smell was appealing. The food looked fine, but my appetite had simply vanished. I ate a few bites out of habit, then covered the plate and put it in the refrigerator. The next morning, I returned to Storage Room 7. I had 40 reliquaries left to catalog, and I worked through them methodically, trying to ignore the iron box sitting on the corner of my work table, but I was aware of it, the way you're aware of someone standing behind you, just outside your peripheral vision. At noon, I took my lunch break. I'd brought a sandwich, but when I unwrapped it, the thought of eating seemed abstract, almost alien, like trying to remember how to perform a task you'd done countless times, but could no longer quite picture. I stared at the sandwich for 10 minutes, then wrapped it back up. That afternoon, alone in the storage room, I weighed the iron box again, 7.3 kilograms. My hands were shaking as I recorded the number. 3 different weights in 24 hours. Except that couldn't be right. Reliquaries don't gain mass. Bone and iron and parchment don't become heavier without cause. Unless something was being added to them, or unless they were drawing something in. I opened the box and examined the contents again. The finger bone looked identical. The parchment note unchanged. But holding the box now, I felt a strange pull, like a subtle magnetism. Not physical exactly, more like the way your attention is drawn to movement in the dark, or how you feel compelled to look when someone is staring at you. I closed the box quickly and left the room early. Over the next week, I lost weight. My pants grew loose. My face looked hollow in the bathroom mirror. Colleagues asked if I was feeling well, and I told them I was fine, just busy with the cataloging project, probably not eating enough. But the truth was, I couldn't remember my last proper meal. I would find food in my refrigerator that I had no memory of preparing, empty plates in my sink that I apparently had used, though I couldn't recall eating from them. And every day, when I was alone in storage room 7, I weighed the iron box, 8.1 kilograms, 9.4, 10.7. It was gaining weight at an accelerating rate. And I was losing it at exactly the same pace. I began researching St. Theophilus. There were dozens of saints by that name, but none from 1114, with any recorded relics in Vatican storage. I searched through medieval martyrologies, hagiographies, even church records of condemnations and excommunications. Nothing matched. Then, at 3:17 one morning, I woke with a memory that wasn't mine. I was in a monastery, refectory, hundreds of years ago. Monks sat at long tables, eating bread and drinking watered wine. But I wasn't eating. I was watching them, feeling their satisfaction, their nourishment, the warmth of food in their stomachs. And I wanted it, not the food. I wanted the feeling of being fed, the sensation of hunger, satisfied. I wanted to consume their consumption, to feed on their satiation. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. The memory faded, but the hunger remained, not for food, for something else, something the iron box understood. The next day, I arrived at storage room 7 to find Father Domenico waiting outside. He was elderly, perhaps 70, with the patient manner of someone who'd spent decades managing the Vatican's more unusual problems. "Marco," he said gently, "I need you to stop weighing the reliquary." I stared at him. "How did you?" "The scale logs are monitored. Certain items flag unusual patterns." He placed a hand on my shoulder. "You've lost considerable weight. You need to eat properly. A full meal, consumed consciously, with gratitude." "I can't remember how," I said, and realized it was true. Father Domenico nodded, as if he'd expected this. "The relic is very old. Older than its label suggests. Before we had clear protocols for such things. He handed me a paper bag. Inside was bread, cheese, and an apple. You will sit in the chapel upstairs. You will pray before eating. You will consume everything in this bag slowly, attentively, thanking God for each bite.
Do you understand?
What is it? I whispered. What's in that box? A hunger that learned to preserve itself, he said. Not for food, but for the act of feeding. It sustains itself by consuming other sustenance, their memory of nourishment, their ability to feel satisfied. He paused. You've been weighing it, measuring its attention, and when you're alone with it, it sees you clearly. The note said, not to let it see me hungry. Yes, but you've been hungry for 2 weeks, Marco, and you've been alone with it every day. He led me upstairs to a small chapel I'd never noticed before, though I'd worked in these buildings for years. He waited while I ate, every bite deliberate, every swallow conscious. The food tasted like memory returning, like waking from a dream of forgetting. When I finished, Father Domenico drove me home himself. You're being reassigned, he said. The Sistine Chapel restoration team needs a specialist in pigment analysis. It's good work. Important work. And the iron box will be moved to a different facility, one with stricter protocols. He glanced at me. Storage room 7 is being restructured. New procedures for items that require observation rather than cataloging. I never returned to that room. My access was revoked the next morning. My files transferred to another specialist, whose name I was never told. The weight logs from my scale were removed from the database. I checked, as if those 2 weeks had never happened. But I still wake sometimes, at 3:17 in the morning, feeling that pull, that magnetic attention from something that learned to feed on feeding, to hunger for others' satisfaction. I eat breakfast now with deliberate gratitude, tasting every bite, remembering what nourishment feels like. Last month, I saw Father Domenico in the Apostolic Archive. He nodded at me across the reading room, then made a small gesture, touching his lips, then his heart, an old blessing, perhaps, or a reminder. There are hungers that cannot be satisfied, only contained, and in the Vatican's deepest storage rooms, in iron boxes, with warnings written in medieval Latin, we keep the relics of saints whose sanctity we can no longer verify, whose appetites outlasted their names. I weigh 163 pounds now. I've gained back everything I lost, but sometimes, when I'm cataloging alone, I feel the weight of attention on me, the sense that something, somewhere beneath the apostolic palace, is watching me eat and measuring what it might take. There are some temperatures the Church maintains, not for preservation, but for containment. My name is Marco Alberti, and I've been a night security guard at the Vatican for 3 years now. I work the shift nobody wants, 10 at night until 6 in the morning, walking the corridors and archives that most visitors never see. It's quiet work, mostly. Peaceful even. The kind of job where you learn to appreciate silence and shadow, where the weight of centuries settles into your bones until you feel like part of the architecture itself. They assigned me to the North Archive on the 15th of January, 2025. It was technically a promotion. Fewer guards had clearance for that section, and the pay was better. My supervisor, a man named Caruso, who'd worked Vatican security for 30 years, walked me through on my first night. The North Archive is different, he told me, as we descended stairs I hadn't known existed, tucked behind a maintenance corridor near the Apostolic Palace. Different protocols, different rules. The temperature dropped with each level. By the time we reached the bottom, perhaps 4 stories below ground, I could see my breath. The corridor stretched ahead, lit by LED strips that had replaced older lighting sometime in the last decade. But the walls were ancient, stone blocks that predated the Renaissance, perhaps even the medieval period. At the end of the corridor stood a vault door, industrial, modern, with a digital temperature display mounted beside it. The readout showed -40 degrees Celsius. Refrigeration unit runs 24 hours, Caruso explained. It's been running since 1973. Your job is to check that display every hour during your rounds. If the temperature ever rises above -38, you trigger the alarm immediately. He pointed to a red button mounted in a sealed case on the wall. Then you run toward the chapel. Don't look back. Don't stop running. What's being preserved in there? I asked. Caruso's expression didn't change. Documents. Very old documents that require climate control. The refrigeration is critical. Check it every hour. Log the temperature in your report. That's Protocol 17. He showed me the rest of my rounds. Other archives, galleries, storage rooms, standard security work. But we always ended back at the North Archive, at that vault door with its temperature display glowing blue in the darkness. That first week was uneventful. I'd make my rounds, check locks and alarms, note anything unusual in my log, and every hour I'd descend to the North Archive and confirm the temperature, always -40, always steady. The scratching started on my 8th night. I heard it during my 2A, mischeck a sound like fingernails on stone, coming from behind the vault door, rhythmic, deliberate. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Pause. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Pause. I stood there in the cold, listening, my breath fogging in the LED light. It stopped after perhaps 30 seconds. The temperature display showed -40 degrees. I logged it and continued my rounds, telling myself it was the refrigeration unit, the metal contracting in the cold, pipes settling, old buildings make sounds. But the next night, it happened again. Same time. 2A. Exactly. The same pattern. Scratch, scratch, pause. Scratch, 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 pause. I timed it. The scratching lasted for 45 seconds. Then silence. On my 10th night, I asked Caruso about it. The refrigeration system makes sounds, he said. Old equipment. Don't worry about it. It's very rhythmic. Like a pattern. Something changed in his face, just for a moment, too quick to identify. Check the temperature every hour. Log it. That's your job. I let it drop. But that night, I brought my phone and recorded the scratching. Just 15 seconds of audio, enough to verify I wasn't imagining things. When I played it back later, in the silence of my apartment, the pattern was clear. 3 scratches, pause. 3 scratches, pause. Over and over. I'd worked as a hospital orderly before joining Vatican security back in my 20s. I'd seen a lot in those years, including patients in various stages of decline. The scratching reminded me of something, but I couldn't place it until my 12th night, when I found myself in the Vatican library during a routine check. I wasn't supposed to browse, but I had 2 hours before my next round, and the library was empty. I found myself in a section on medieval history, pulling volumes at random. One was a medical text from the 14th century, documenting plague symptoms and treatment methods. There was a chapter on starvation, charts showing the progression of hunger in siege victims, the stages of decline, the behaviors associated with each phase. One chart documented scratching patterns. Victims in advanced starvation would scratch at walls or doors in rhythmic patterns. The body's last desperate attempt to communicate need. 3 scratches represented hunger. According to the text, prisoners and siege victims would scratch this pattern repeatedly, sometimes for hours, until they lost the strength to continue. I stood there in the library, the book open in my hands, and felt cold despite the warm air. That night, during my 2 AD, missed a check, I listened more carefully. The scratching came through the vault door, muffled by steel and insulation, but unmistakable. Scratch, scratch, pause. 3 scratches. Hunger, over and over. The temperature display showed minus 40 degrees Celsius. I started arriving early to my shifts, using the extra time to research. I couldn't access the Vatican's classified archives, but I found references in 1973, the same year Caruso said the refrigeration unit was installed. There had been a reorganization of the secret archives. Certain documents were moved to climate-controlled storage. The official reason was preservation of sensitive materials, but I found a memo, misfiled in a public section, referencing Protocol 17 and indefinite containment procedures. The memo was dated March 19, 1973. It mentioned temperature requirements and emergency protocols. It had been signed by 3 cardinals, all dead now. On my 15th night, I made a mistake during my 2A. Mischeck. I didn't just listen to the scratching. I approached the vault door. I placed my palm against the cold steel, feeling the vibration of the refrigeration unit, the deep hum of machinery, keeping something frozen. The scratching stopped. For perhaps 30 seconds, there was complete silence. Then, a different sound began. Not scratching, something else. A rhythmic exhalation, like breathing, slow and deliberate. The sound of someone drawing breath in a cold place. The temperature display flickered, minus 39.8 degrees. I stepped back from the door. The breathing continued. In, out, in, out. Each exhalation seemed to fog against the inside of the vault door, though I couldn't see anything. Just the sound, intimate and horrible, of something breathing in the cold. The temperature dropped back to minus 40. The breathing stopped. The scratching resumed. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Pause. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Pause. I logged the temperature and left, walking quickly back toward the stairs. I didn't run. I told myself there was no reason to run, but at 3:17 a.m., the alarm went off. The sound echoed through every level of the Vatican. A high, piercing wail that meant emergency, that meant something had gone wrong. I was in the Apostolic Archive, 2 floors above the North Archive, when I heard it, and I knew, without checking, what it meant. I ran toward the stairs. Not up, toward the exits, but down, toward the North Archive. I can't explain why. Training, maybe, or curiosity, or something else. The pull of obligation, the need to see what I'd been guarding without understanding. The temperature display was flashing red, minus 36 degrees, minus 35, rising fast. Caruso appeared from somewhere behind me, moving faster than I'd ever seen him move. He grabbed my arm with surprising strength. "The chapel," he said. His voice was absolutely level, professional. "Now, what's happening? Run toward the chapel. Don't look back." He pulled me toward the stairs. As we climbed, I heard other sounds from below. Not scratching now. Movement. The groan of metal under stress, and underneath it all, that breathing, louder now, no longer muffled by the vault door. We ran through corridors I'd walked 100 times, but they seemed longer now, the shadows deeper. Other guards joined us, all moving in the same direction, toward the Sistine Chapel, toward sanctified ground. Nobody spoke. We just ran. Behind us, I heard a sound like a door opening. Not the vault, something else, something that had been waiting. The chapel doors were open, candles lit despite the hour. A priest I didn't recognize stood at the entrance, ushering us inside. When the last guard entered, he closed the doors and blessed them, murmuring prayers in Latin. We stayed there until dawn. None of us spoke. At 6 a.m., Caruso's phone rang. He listened for a moment, then nodded. "It's contained," he said. "Temperatures restored." Nobody asked what had been contained. We filed out of the chapel in silence, signed out of our shift, went home. I worked one more week at the Vatican. They assigned me back to the upper galleries, the tourist sections. I never returned to the North Archive. On my last day, Caruso approached me in the locker room. "You did well," he said. "Followed protocol." What was behind that door? He looked at me for a long moment. "Documents," he said finally. "Very old documents. Some things the church preserves because they're sacred, and some things we preserve because destroying them would be worse." I left Vatican security that month. I work mall security now, in a new building with bright lights and no history. Sometimes, at 3:17 a fair, I wake up and remember the cold, the scratching, the breathing on the other side of steel, and I wonder what would have happened if the temperature had kept rising. What would have emerged from that vault, hungry, after decades of frozen silence, scratching its pattern against the door. 3 scratches. 3 scratches. 3 scratches. The Vatican's refrigeration unit still runs in the North Archive. I know, because I checked 24 hours a day, maintaining -40 degrees Celsius, keeping something contained. Protocol 17 remains active. New guards learn the rules. Check the temperature every hour. If it rises, run toward the chapel. Don't look back. Some of them ask questions. Most don't. I didn't destroy my recording of the scratching. Sometimes I play it late at night and count the pattern. 3 scratches. Pause. 3 scratches. Pause. The rhythm of hunger, preserved in digital format, extracted from a place where hunger itself has been frozen for over 50 years. The church maintains many temperatures, some for preservation, some for containment, and some, I think, as penance, keeping something alive in the cold because letting it die would be a mercy we cannot grant. Concept summary. Vatican archivist Thomas Beaumont restores an 18th century confessional removed from a Quebec mission, discovering hundreds of tally marks carved inside the priest's panel, alongside a Latin warning about absolution. As he works, he develops an involuntary compulsion to count his own teeth, a habit that reveals something transferred through the act of restoration itself. Some objects retain the shape of what was spoken into them. My name is Thomas Beaumont, and I've served as a restoration archivist in the Vatican's collection of historical liturgical furnishings for 19 years. It's quiet work, technical and solitary. The preservation of altars, pulpits, baptismal fonts, and confessionals removed from churches across the centuries. Most pieces come to us damaged or obsolete, replaced by modern equivalents in their original parishes. We catalog them, restore what can be saved, and store them in climate-controlled vaults beneath the Apostolic Palace. The work requires patience and reverence. These objects have heard prayers, witnessed sacraments, held the weight of human confession and divine response. In September of 2023, a confessional arrived from our depot in Montreal. The paperwork indicated it had been removed from the Mission Saint Francois Xavier in 1703 and held in church storage ever since. No explanation for its removal was given, only a notation in faded ink. Transféré par ordre de l'évêque, ne pas restaurer. Transferred by order of the bishop. Do not restore, but 3 centuries had passed. An institutional memory fades. The current bishop of Montreal, unaware of any prohibition, had included it in a donation of historical pieces. By the time it reached my workroom, it was simply another artifact requiring assessment. The confessional was constructed of dark walnut, ornately carved with symbols of penitence, thorns, tears, a pelican piercing its breast. The wood had aged beautifully, though the interior panels showed water damage and the kneeler had rotted through. I began documentation on a Tuesday morning, photographing every surface, noting the joints and joinery, the wear patterns that revealed centuries of use. When I opened the priest's panel, the narrow chamber where the confessor would sit, I found the marks. They covered the interior wall that faced the penitent's screen. Hundreds of tally marks, carved directly into the wood with something sharp. They were grouped in sets of 5, traditional counting marks, arranged in neat columns that covered nearly every available surface. I counted them twice, 730 marks exactly, and beneath them, carved in careful Latin script, Triginta visibus, absolvi antiquam intellexi. I absolved it 30 times before I understood. No signature. No date beyond the confessional's known origin. Just that single phrase and the compulsive counting that surrounded it. I photographed everything and sent images to Father De Luca in the archives of unusual devotional practices. He called me within an hour. Where did this come from? His voice was tense in a way I'd never heard. Quebec, 1703, a mission church. The paperwork. Was there an Episcopal order? I checked the file. Yes, not to restore it. A long silence. Then, continue your work. Document everything. I'll review the Montreal archives for context. He didn't tell me to stop. That should have meant something. I spent the next days working on the confessional's exterior, cleaning and stabilizing the wood, repairing the joinery, standard restoration procedures. But I found myself returning to the priest's panel repeatedly, running my fingers over those tally marks, reading that Latin phrase, trying to understand what required absolution. 30 times. What could be absolved 30 times. It was during lunch on the 3rd day that I first noticed the habit. I was eating at my workbench, a sandwich, nothing unusual, when I realized my tongue was moving across my teeth, counting them. Upper right, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Upper left, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Lower right, lower left. The same sequence, repeated unconsciously. I stopped immediately, shook my head, embarrassed by the odd tick, resumed eating. But my tongue moved again, counting, making sure. By evening, I'd counted my teeth 17 times. I began noting when it happened, always during moments of stillness, of distraction. My tongue would move of its own accord, touching each tooth in sequence, ensuring the count remained correct. 32 teeth. Always 32. Father DeLuca returned my call on Friday. The mission records are incomplete, he said. But I found a letter from 1704, a year after the confessional was removed. The mission's priest, Father Etienne Rousseau, was recalled to France for spiritual recuperation. He never returned to service. What happened to him? The letter doesn't specify. But it references an incident of prolonged confessions and recommends the confessional be neither used nor destroyed, but held in perpetual storage for 300 years. Until someone forgot why, Father DeLuca said quietly. Thomas, how much work remains? I looked at the confessional. The exterior was complete. Only the interior panels needed attention, cleaning, stabilizing, minor repairs. A week, perhaps less. Be careful with the priest's chamber. Don't sand those marks. Don't try to remove them. Why would I? Just don't. He paused. And Thomas, if you notice anything unusual, anything at all, stop work immediately and call me. I promised I would, but I didn't tell him about the counting. It seemed irrelevant. A nervous habit developed from stress or poor sleep. On Monday, I began work on the interior panels. The wood inside the priest's chamber had warped from humidity, pulling away from the frame. I carefully removed each panel, planning to treat and reinstall them. As I lifted the back panel, the one covered in tally marks, something fell from behind it. A piece of yellowed paper, folded many times, tucked into the narrow gap between panel and frame. I unfolded it with archival gloves. The handwriting was hurried, barely legible. French, dated March 17th, 1700. 3. I cannot stop absolving it. It confesses the same sin each night. I hear the words through the screen, though no one kneels there. The sin of counting, of making sure. It counts itself over and over, and when I give absolution, it counts again to be certain. The absolution took. 30 times I have given the sacrament to an empty confessional. 30 times it has counted itself afterward. I understand now. It is not seeking forgiveness. It is ensuring I am still here, still listening, still able to count. The note ended there. No signature, but it could only have been Father Rousseau. My tongue moved across my teeth. Counting, I set the note aside and continued working, telling myself it was just a disturbed priest's delusion, a story to explain why the confessional had been removed, colonial superstition, nothing more. But that night, at 3:17 in the morning, I woke with my fingers in my mouth, touching each tooth, counting, making absolutely certain that each one remained in place. I tried to stop, pulled my hand away, but within minutes, my tongue resumed the count. Upper right, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It wasn't my habit. It was the confessional's. The next day, I called Father DeLuca, told him everything. The note, the counting, the involuntary compulsion that grew stronger each hour. He listened in silence. "Stop work," he said finally. "Don't go back to the workroom. It's almost finished, Thomas." His voice was sharp, afraid. Whatever was confessed into that confessional, whatever Father Rousseau absolved 30 times before he understood, it's still there. It transfers through contact, through proximity, through the act of restoration. You're not counting your teeth because you want to. You're counting them because it wants you to. What is it? I don't know. But Father Rousseau spent 3 months in that confessional before they removed him. He died in France 2 years later. The records say he stopped speaking entirely, just sat in his room, touching his teeth, counting silently. I hung up, looked at my hands. They were trembling. I should have left, should have followed Father DeLuca's instruction. But the confessional was so close to completion. Just the interior panels to reinstall, perhaps 2 hours of work. I couldn't leave a restoration unfinished. I returned to the workroom. The panels were laid out on my bench, including the one covered in tally marks. I picked it up carefully, preparing to reinstall it in the priest's chamber. As I positioned it against the frame, I heard something. A whisper. Through the confessional screen. Latin, spoken in a voice that sounded like wind through a narrow space. Quote, "Dentes habs. How many teeth do you have?" My tongue moved immediately, counting. Upper right, upper left, lower right, lower left. 32. I counted them 3 times to be certain. "Confirma," the whisper said. "Confirm." I counted again and again. Each time the voice asked, I counted. I couldn't stop. My hands moved to my mouth, fingers touching each tooth, verifying what my tongue had already confirmed. "I absolve you," I whispered. The words came without thought, automatic. The only response I could form. The voice asked again. "Quat dentis habs?" I counted. 32. 32. "Confirma." I don't know how many times I counted. How many times I whispered absolution into the empty confessional. The light through the workroom's high window shifted from morning to afternoon to evening. And still the voice asked, and still I counted. Father DeLuca found me just after midnight. He said I was sitting in the priest's chamber, my fingers bloody from touching my teeth, so obsessively that I'd worn through the gums. He said I was whispering numbers in Latin, counting over and over. He pulled me out, locked the workroom, had me taken to the Vatican's medical facility. I spent 4 days there. The counting stopped gradually, though even now, 3 months later, I sometimes wake at 3:17 with my tongue moving across my teeth, making absolutely certain. The confessional has been moved to a sealed vault in sublevel 7. Father DeLuca stamped the file himself, red ink diagonal across the documentation. Custodire in perpetuum, non restarere, non apparere, to be kept forever. Not to be restored, not to be opened. No one has asked me about those 4 days. No one has mentioned the confessional or Father Rousseau or what was confessed into that narrow wooden chamber 3 centuries ago in Quebec. But last week, a new restoration archivist was hired. Young, eager, skilled in 18th century woodwork. Father DeLuca introduced us briefly. As we shook hands, I noticed his tongue moving in his mouth, subtle, unconscious. Counting. Some correspondence arrives, with instructions never to acknowledge its receipt. My name is Yuki Tanaka, and I've served as a preservation officer in the Vatican secret archives for 7 years. My role is technical, not theological. I assess, catalog, and stabilize documents from dissolved religious houses before they enter the permanent collection. Monastery closures, parish consolidations, the ordinary administrative death of small religious communities. Their records come to us in boxes and tubes, centuries of devotion reduced to inventory numbers and climate-controlled storage. I work in sublevel 2, in a laboratory few visitors know exists. The air is precisely calibrated, 21 degrees Celsius, 40% humidity. We wear cotton gloves. We document everything. The work requires patience and reverence, but not faith. I'm here because I understand paper and ink, binding techniques, and preservation chemistry. What the documents say is not my concern. What they are made of, that is my expertise. On the morning of April 3rd, 2024, a copper tube arrived from the Abbey of Saint-Michel-des-Ombres in the Dordogne region of France. The abbey had been officially dissolved in January. Its 3 remaining monks transferred to other communities. Standard procedure. But the tube was marked with a red wax seal I'd never seen. Not the usual archival designation, but something older. A notation in faded ink. Direction of Monsignor Toretti. Only. Monsignor Toretti has worked in the archives for 42 years. He oversees what we call the restricted collections, documents requiring special authorization to access. He came to my laboratory within an hour of the tube's arrival, moving with the careful urgency of someone responding to an expected emergency. "You'll process this personally," he said, placing the tube on my workstation. "Document the contents, but do not digitize. Do not transcribe. Physical inspection only. Should I log it in the standard database? Use the red folder system," he said, which meant the document would exist in our records only as a reference number, its contents undescribed. He left me with the tube. The copper was old, perhaps 18th century, sealed with what appeared to be beeswax mixed with something darker. I photographed it from every angle, then carefully removed the seal. Inside were 6 letters, written on heavy paper that had yellowed with age, though not as much as I would have expected. The handwriting was precise, educated, the ink a deep brown that seemed too rich for standard iron gall. Each letter was dated and signed. Father Lucien Morel, Abbey of Saint-Michel-des-Ombres. The earliest was dated November 9th, 2014. The latest, March 27th, 2024, just 1 week before the tube arrived. I laid them out in chronological order and began my assessment. Paper composition, ink analysis, evidence of handling or environmental damage, standard preservation protocol. But as I examined them under magnification, I noticed something unusual. The ink had an organic quality I'd never encountered, not quite vegetable-based, not mineral. Under the microscope, it showed a cellular structure. I started reading the first letter to understand the context, as I often do. It was addressed to the congregation for the doctrine of the faith, marked urgent, request for guidance. Father Lucien described being called to administer last rites to a man in the abbey's infirmary, a vagrant who'd collapsed near their gates during a winter storm. The man was dying, clearly, his breathing shallow and irregular. Father Lucien performed the sacrament according to form, anointing him with the sacred oils, speaking the prescribed prayers. But the man didn't die. His breathing steadied. His wounds, severe frostbite, Exposure began to heal visibly as Father Lucian watched. Within an hour, the man was conscious and asking for food. I believed I had witnessed a miracle, Father Lucian wrote. I gave thanks to God. But then the man spoke to me in a language I did not recognize, and when I looked into his eyes, I saw something that I cannot adequately describe. Not evil, as I understand it, but absence, a void where recognition should exist. The letter ended with a formal request for guidance. Should the man be released, reported to civil authorities. Was this a matter for the congregation? There was no record of a response in the tube. I moved to the second letter, dated February 15th, 2015. 3 months later, Father Lucian wrote that the man remained at the abbey. He could not be released because he did not stay healed. Each night, his body deteriorated, wounds reopening, flesh necrotizing, and each morning after receiving communion, he recovered. Not gradually, instantly, he consumes the Eucharist with a hunger that disturbs me, Father Lucian wrote. Not reverent, not grateful, simply hungry, and afterward, his flesh knits itself whole again, as though the body of Christ is the only sustenance that can sustain him. The letter included careful observations. The man never spoke, except in that unknown language. He showed no interest in leaving. He would sit in the chapel for hours, staring at the tabernacle with an expression Father Lucian described as profound longing mixed with something like grief. I set the letter down and checked my measurements. The ink was consistent across both documents, that same organic brown with unusual cellular structure. I made a note to run a spectroscopic analysis. The third letter, dated October 9th, 2016, described an incident. The man had died during the night, completely, not the partial deterioration of previous nights. His body was cold, without pulse or breath. Father Lucian administered last rites again, properly, believing this was finally the end. But at dawn, when the abbey bells rang for lauds, the man sat up, breathing, healed, as though death itself had been temporary. I no longer believe this is a miracle, Father Lucian wrote. I believe I am witnessing something older than our sacraments, something that has learned to use them for purposes we do not understand. The holy oils and prayers, they are not healing him, they are binding him to a cycle he cannot escape. The fourth letter, dated January 12th, 2019, was shorter, more clinical. Father Lucian had been administering last rites regularly now, sometimes twice a week, whenever the man's deterioration became severe. The man had stopped eating normal food entirely. Only the Eucharist sustained him, and he had begun to weep during Mass. Silently, continuously. I asked him why he weeps, Father Lucian wrote. He responded in that unknown language, but his tone was clear. He was not asking for help. He was apologizing. I paused my assessment. The laboratory was quiet, except for the climate control system's gentle hum. I've processed thousands of documents from closed monasteries, administrative records, devotional journals, even a few cases of priests documenting possible miracles for official review. But this felt different, wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. I should have stopped there, logged what I'd found, let Monsignor Toretti decide the next steps. But I picked up the fifth letter, dated November 3rd, 2022. It described the man's escape attempt. He had tried to leave the abbey. Walking into the nearby forest, Father Lucian and the other monks found him 3 days later, lying in a ravine. He had been dead long enough that animals had begun to feed on him. They brought his body back, uncertain what else to do. The next morning, at Lauds, he revived. But this time, parts of him didn't heal completely. The sections consumed by animals remained absent. He was incomplete now. Still living, still hungry, still weeping. I believe he wanted to escape the Eucharist, Father Lucien wrote, to finally die beyond the reach of our sacraments. But we brought him back. We condemned him to this. The handwriting in this letter was less steady than the others. The ink, darker. I tested a sample under the spectrometer before reading the final letter. The results took several minutes to process, and when they appeared on my screen, I had to run the test twice more to be certain. The ink was not iron gall, not vegetable dye. It was lipid-based, animal fat rendered and mixed with carbon. The cellular structure I'd seen under the microscope was adipose tissue, carefully melted and strained, mixed with ash to create a dark, stable ink. Human fat. The laboratory's database was very specific about the markers. The final letter was dated March 27th, 2024, 1 week ago. The handwriting was barely legible, pressed so hard into the paper that it had torn in places. The abbey is dissolved, Father Lucien wrote. We are to be dispersed to other communities, but the man remains. He cannot be moved. He cannot be allowed to die. I have administered last rites 247 times. Each time, I bind him more tightly to this existence. Each time, he begs me, in that unknown language, to stop. I understand now what he is asking forgiveness for, not for what he's done. For what he is, for existing beyond the boundary where existence should end. I can no longer perform the sacrament with oil consecrated for healing. It is obscene to use sacred things to perpetuate suffering. So I have prepared new ink from the only source that seems appropriate. From the flesh, he can no longer restore. This letter is written in what he has lost, what we took from him by bringing him back. I am sending this to Rome, because someone must know, must decide. I cannot be the one to continue this, but I cannot be the one to let him finally die either. That choice is not mine to make. He is still in the infirmary, still breathing, still hungry, still bound by every prayer I've spoken over him. The letter was signed in the same dark ink. When I touched it with my gloved finger to test the paper quality, the ink was warm, not room temperature, body temperature. I went immediately to Monsignor Toretti's office. He was waiting, as though he'd known I would come. The monastery, I asked. Being sterilized, he said. The building will be sold to a private owner. There is no one left there now. And Father Lucien, Monsignor Toretti, looked at me for a long moment. Father Lucien passed away on March 28th, heart failure. He was found in the abbey's chapel. The day after he'd sent the letters, I set the copper tube on his desk. What do I do with these? Log them with a red folder number? Store them in the climate-controlled vault in sub-level 4, standard preservation protocol for sensitive materials, and the subject of the letters. The man in the infirmary. There is no man, Monsignor Toretti said quietly. The abbey was empty when the dissolution team arrived. All that remained was correspondence. Father Lucien had prepared for archival transfer. I wanted to ask more, to demand answers, but his expression held the same careful finality as the red wax seal on the copper tube. I processed the letters according to protocol. I assigned them a reference number that describes nothing. They are stored now in sublevel 4, in a vault I do not have authorization to access. But I kept one detail from my report: the spectroscopic analysis. The proof that the final letter was written in rendered human fat. That evidence remains only in my personal laboratory notes, and I have never mentioned it to Monsignor Toretti, because 3 weeks after the letters arrived, I received a new directive, starting immediately. All correspondence from dissolved monasteries in France must be processed by me personally. Any documents written in unusual inks must be tested and reported to Monsignor Toretti before cataloging. And last week, another copper tube arrived. Same red wax seal, same notation requesting Monsignor Toretti's direction from an abbey in Brittany, recently dissolved. I haven't opened it yet. It sits on my workstation, and when I place my hand near it, I can feel warmth emanating from the copper. Not much, just enough to notice, just enough to know that whatever Father Lucian found in his infirmary, whatever he bound with 247 administrations of last rites, it was not unique. And somewhere in France, in other dissolved abbeys, other priests have been performing the same merciful curse, keeping something alive that should have been allowed to die. The tube will be opened tomorrow. I will process its contents with the same professional care I've given every document that crosses my station. I will test the ink, measure the paper, document everything. But tonight, at 3:17 in the morning, I woke with absolute certainty that I am not meant to know what I already know. That some duties of the Church are not preservation, but containment. That the sacraments, administered with perfect devotion, can bind as surely as they can free, and that hunger, once sustained by sacred means, may be the cruelest miracle of all. Some saints are venerated, others are maintained. My name is Caterina Rossi, and I've served as a junior archivist in the Vatican secret archives for 6 years. My work involves cataloging correspondence, cross-referencing papal documents, and occasionally researching obscure theological questions for the Congregation for the Causes of Saints. It's quiet work, the kind that requires patience and precision. Most days I see only documents, centuries-old paper and ink, the accumulated record of faith preserved in climate-controlled darkness. In September of 2024, I was assigned to investigate historical anomalies in the liturgical calendar. Specifically, saints who had been removed, not for lack of historical evidence, which is common, but for reasons the records described only as pastoral concerns. There were 7 names on my list. Saint Marius was the third. According to the file, Marius had been a hermit in the Sabine Hills during the 8th century. He'd lived in a cave, subsisting on wild herbs and rainwater, and was credited with several miracles: healing the sick, multiplication of bread, the usual hagiographic elements. After his death, his body was brought to Rome and enshrined in a small church near the Lateran. The faithful venerated him for nearly 1,000 years. Then, in January of 1834, his feast day was quietly removed from the Roman calendar. The file gave no explanation, only a reference number leading to a separate archive. Sub-basement 3, restricted reliquary access. I'd never been to sub-basement 3. Most archivists haven't. It requires special authorization, and the entrance isn't marked on any official map of the Vatican. I submitted my request through Father Domenico, the archive's chief custodian. He's 73, thin as parchment, with the careful movements of someone who spent decades handling fragile things. He studied my request for a long moment. "Saint Marius," he said quietly, "you're researching the removals." "Yes, Father." The file references materials in the restricted reliquary. He removed his reading glasses and cleaned them. A gesture I'd learned meant he was considering how much to tell me. "The reliquary has protocols," he said finally. "You'll be accompanied. You may observe and document, but you will not touch anything without explicit permission. And Katerina," he looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Some research ends with more questions than answers. This is acceptable. The Church values the questions we choose not to pursue." 2 days later, I descended to sub-basement 3 with Father Domenico and Brother Luca, a Franciscan who served as reliquary custodian. The elevator required a copper key and descended for nearly a minute, far deeper than any basement should go. When the doors opened, the air was different. Cooler, yes, but also heavier, as if pressurized. The reliquary was a long corridor lined with niches, each containing remains of saints and martyrs. Some were in crystal reliquaries, others in simple wooden boxes. Small plaques identified each one, along with dates and brief descriptions. Brother Luca led us past dozens of them, deeper into the corridor, until we reached a section with no plaques at all. "The maintenance cases," Brother Luca said. His voice was soft, almost apologetic. "Saints who require special care." He stopped at a niche sealed with an iron gate. Behind it, I could see a glass case containing a body dressed in simple monastic robes. Even from several feet away, the preservation was remarkable. The skin appeared supple, the features peaceful. Incorrupt bodies aren't uncommon among saints, but this was extraordinary. Brother Luca unlocked the gate. Then the glass case, the smell that emerged was unexpected. Not decay, but salt and something else. Something organic and wrong beneath the mineral tang. "Saint Marius," Father Domenico said, "removed from veneration in 1834 by order of Pope Gregory XVI. The documentation you requested." He handed me a red-stamped folder. I opened it carefully. The first document was a letter from a Cardinal Matteo Corsini to the Pope, dated January 4th, 1834. The Latin was formal, but the message was clear. The body of Saint Marius had become spiritually unstable, following a lapse in prescribed preservation protocols. 3 priests had been reassigned. The cardinal recommended immediate removal from public veneration and implementation of continuous maintenance procedures. The next document was a protocol sheet, updated monthly for 189 years. Each entry recorded the same action: replacement of blessed salt in stomach cavity. Each entry was initialed by a different priest or brother, along with the date and time, always the first day of the month, always at dawn. "You maintain this?" I asked Brother Luca. "Every month." "I've maintained it for 11 years, he said. "Before me, Brother Paolo, for 37 years. Before him, others. The protocol is never interrupted." I looked at the body again. From this close, I could see that the robes had been opened at the abdomen, not torn, but carefully parted to reveal the preserved skin beneath. There was a seam there, surgically precise, that would allow access to the stomach cavity. "Why salt?" I asked. Brother Luca and Father Domenico exchanged a glance. "It's a preservative," Father Domenico said carefully. "Blessed salt has been used in church ritual for centuries. It sanctifies. It purifies. He paused. It maintains boundaries. I spent the next hour photographing documents and taking notes. The protocol sheets went back to 1834 without interruption, nearly 2,300 entries, each one marking a monthly ritual performed in darkness and silence, deep beneath the Vatican. Whatever had happened in January of 1834 had been serious enough to warrant nearly 2 centuries of unbroken maintenance. I was preparing to leave when Brother Luca's phone rang, an incongruous sound in that ancient space. He answered, listened, and went very pale. When he asked, "Then, I understand. I'm coming now." He ended the call and looked at Father Domenico. Brother Matteo is in hospital, stroke. He was supposed to perform the replacement yesterday morning. The silence that followed was absolute. Yesterday, Father Domenico said quietly, the first of the month. I had a conference in Florence, Brother Luca said, and his voice was shaking. Brother Matteo was covering for me. I should have confirmed. I should have confirmed. I should have. He stopped. It's been 36 hours. Father Domenico's hand went to the rosary at his belt. We do it now. Caterina, you need to leave. I can help. You need to leave. His voice was sharp. Final. Go upstairs. Go to the chapel of St. Lawrence and wait there. Do not come back down. Do you understand? I wanted to argue, but something in his face stopped me. I'd never seen Father Domenico frightened before. I took the elevator up, but I didn't go to the chapel. I couldn't. Instead, I went to my office and pulled every file I could find on St. Marius. Not just the removal documents, but the original hagiographies, the miracle accounts, everything. The earliest sources described Marius's hermitage as a place of great holiness. Pilgrims would visit seeking healing and guidance. But there were other accounts, marginalized ones, that told a different story. Marius had lived in that cave for 40 years without food, not fasting, actually not eating. Pilgrims brought him bread, and he would bless it, but he never consumed anything himself. One account, written by a monk who'd visited the hermitage shortly before Marius's death, described something disturbing. The monk had arrived at dawn and found Marius in prayer. But the prayers weren't in Latin or any language the monk recognized. And when Marius finally acknowledged his visitor, the monk wrote that the saint's eyes were empty of everything save hunger. I was reading this when my phone rang. It was 3:17 in the morning, Father Domenico's number. "Don't come down," he said, without preamble. His voice was raw. "Don't come down here, Caterina. We're sealing the section." What happened? A long pause. I could hear something in the background. Not words, but a sound like breathing, heavy and wet. "The salt," Father Domenico said finally. "It wasn't for preservation. It was for suppression." 36 hours, and he stopped. Some saints perform miracles. Others require miracles to be performed upon them, to keep them from performing their nature. I don't understand. Saint Marius never needed food because he took sustenance another way. We don't know how. We don't know from what source. But when he died, his body didn't stop. The salt creates a barrier, a spiritual cauterization. Without it, another pause. The protocol has been restored. We're monitoring the situation. Is Brother Luca? Brother Luca is being treated. He'll recover. We were fortunate. He didn't sound like he believed it. Your research on St. Marius is complete, Katerina. The file will be marked conclusive and sealed. You'll receive a new assignment tomorrow. The call ended. I didn't sleep that night. At dawn, I returned to my office and found a new red-stamped folder on my desk. Inside was a single document, a transfer of my research to the congregation's classified archives, along with a notation that St. Marius was to remain delisted in perpetuity for pastoral concerns. There was also a handwritten note from Father Domenico. Some removals are acts of mercy for the faithful and for the saint. I've continued my work on the liturgical calendar, but St. Marius was the last removal I investigated. I don't ask about sub-basement 3 anymore, and I don't descend below sub-basement 1. Sometimes I see Brother Luca in the archives, moving quietly through the stacks. He's thinner now, and he never meets my eyes. Last month, I noticed a new name added to the protocol sheet for restricted reliquaries. The sheet isn't hidden. It's filed with other maintenance schedules, mundane and unremarkable. But I recognize the date pattern. First day of each month, always at dawn. There are now 2 entries requiring monthly salt replacement. The second name isn't listed. The notation just says attendant S.M., presumably related to St. Marius. I don't know who it refers to. I don't ask, but I think about Brother Luca and those 36 hours when the protocol lapsed. I think about what Father Domenico said, that some saints perform miracles, and others require miracles to be performed upon them. I think about hunger that survives death, and what it means to subsist without consuming anything we can see. The protocol continues. Every month, without fail, Brother Luca still performs it, along with 2 others now, never alone, never with less than 3 witnesses. Some saints are venerated, others are maintained, and in the deepest levels of the Vatican, in niches without plaques, there are bodies that haven't truly died and hungers that blessed salt can only temporarily restrain. I understand now why Father Domenico warned me that some questions are better left unpursued. But I still wake at 3:17 in the morning, wondering what happens in that moment when the old salt is removed and the cavity lies empty, even for a few seconds, wondering what tries to fill that space and what it feeds on while it waits. There are corridors beneath the apostolic archives that are colder than the tombs, yet no one is buried there. My name is Beatrice Romano. I serve as an archivist under the Office of Sacred Documentation within Vatican City. My duties are procedural, quiet, deliberate, and exacting. I catalog sealed correspondences, carbon-dated ledgers, and the classified maintenance logs that the world will never see. In the early months of the year 2024, I was assigned to assist Security Supervisor Chen Wei, a man of few words and impeccable posture, with the preservation of analog surveillance tapes dating from the 1980s through the early 2000s. They came from what the internal memos referred to as Section Invernale, the winter sections. The winter sections are not public, nor are they officially part of the Vatican Museum or its archives. Their existence is noted only in maintenance rosters, always accompanied by temperature warnings and containment codes I had never seen before. When I asked Chen Wei why the rooms were kept at -5 degrees year-round, he said only, temperature stabilizes behavior. I didn't ask whose. The rooms were impossible to enter without written consent from the Secretariat, but the footage, grainy, flickering, mostly silent, was stored in a temperature-controlled vault near the archives. Chen handled the transfer protocols, while I logged the catalog numbers into the digital system. At first, it felt like routine clerical work, but I began to notice patterns. Every tape was precisely 17 minutes longer than the time logged on its label. Every guard recorded inside those corridors appeared to pause mid-stride at least once, their breath misting in the air, their eyes fixed on the same blank wall. 17 minutes. Always. Chen Wei was methodical. He never explained, never speculated, and seemed to watch me carefully whenever I asked a question. One evening, as we reviewed footage from 1992, the image stuttered, a frame of static, and when it returned, the guard on screen was frozen mid-step. His flashlight beam glared across the wall, illuminating Frost. His mouth was slightly open, as if caught between words. The timer in the corner continued to run, but he didn't move for 17 minutes. Then, as abruptly as he had stopped, he lowered his arm and walked on, expression unchanged. Motion lag, Chen said, almost automatically, but his voice was tight. I made a note on the log sheet. Anomaly, 17 minutes. Guard hash 146B. Chen reached across the table and crossed out my note with a single black line. He said nothing further, but when he rose to leave, he lingered by the door and added softly, 17 minutes is a long time to stand still. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the sound of the faint hum in the footage, the slow mechanical exhale of the air systems that seemed to grow louder during each pause. It was almost rhythmic, like breathing. A week later, while inventorying sealed correspondence, I found a document labeled Codex Thermorum, Restricted Temperature Control Directives, Section Phi. It bore the red wax insignia of the Secretariat and a ribbon drawn tightly around the parchment tube. When I held it under the archive lamp, the wax shimmered faintly, not red, but the deep brown of dried blood. Beneath the official script, faint letters began to emerge through the fiber of the parchment, as though pressed from within. My name, Beatrice Romano, followed by a date, December 17th, 2024. It was March when I found it. The following days blurred together. Chen grew distant, though I often felt him standing behind me longer than necessary as I worked. His eyes would drift toward the temperature monitors mounted on the archive wall, each displaying a constant digital reading of 5 degrees Celsius. One morning, I found the monitor had dropped to -3. No one else seemed to notice. That same day, I received a memo, unsigned, informing me that my assistance in the winter section's review would now be unnecessary. I was reassigned to routine ledger digitization. The next day, however, Chen appeared at my office door holding a fresh tape, unlabeled, still wrapped in frost. He placed it on my desk and said, "You should see this one before it's destroyed." The label inside the plastic casing bore the words, Section Invernale, Corridor C, December 17, 2024. I frowned. That's 10 months from now. Chen nodded once, expression unreadable. The system recorded it this morning. We loaded it into the player. Static filled the screen, then gradually resolved into the narrow passage of a maintenance corridor. Frost clung to the walls like white dust. The date in the corner was correct. December 17, 2024, and the timer began. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a woman entered the frame. Dark hair, small build, the distinct navy cardigan issued to archivists. She walked carefully, clipboard in hand. I froze. Chen reached over and stopped the tape. It was me. My image paused mid-step, eyes fixed on the same blank wall, the earlier guards had faced. My breath misted in the air. The timer continued running. 17 minutes. When the recording resumed normal motion, the woman, the me, lowered her clipboard and walked out of frame. Chen ejected the tape and slid it back into its case without a word. I asked him if it was fabricated, if it was some kind of test. He didn't answer. He only said, "Some sections record in advance. It's the temperature." That night, I began waking at exactly 3:17 in the morning, shivering though the room was warm. Each time, my clock would blink the same numbers, and faint frost would bloom across the inside of my window pane, despite the humid Roman air. The next morning, I returned to the archives and found my red-ribboned document gone. The shelf label had been replaced by a small card that read, "Sealed under Directive Chen, Winter Containment." I confronted Chen in the surveillance room, though the word confront feels too strong. He was standing before the bank of monitors, each showing a feed from the winter sections. The corridors glowed in their perpetual cold unlit, except for the camera's infrared. "Why do they keep them cold?" I asked. He didn't turn. "Because warmth wakes them." His voice trembled slightly, not with fear, but reverence. On the central screen, a guard was making his rounds. Suddenly, his flashlight beam caught the frost on the wall, and he stopped moving. The timer began counting. 17 minutes. But this time, the camera zoomed slightly, unprompted, as if drawn closer by its own will, and I saw in the frost faint impressions forming. Not reflections, not cracks. Words. Beatrice Romano, December 17, 2024. I took an involuntary step back. Chen finally looked at me. "It's not your name yet. It's only written when you look." Something in the room seemed to tilt, an invisible gravity pulling downward. The monitors flickered. The air grew cold enough that my breath fogged before me. On one of the feeds, the woman, the me, appeared again, standing in the corridor, facing the wall. I hadn't been there. I was here, standing beside Chen, yet her image remained, perfectly still, breath clouding before her. The camera timestamp read March 3rd, 2024. The exact date and time I stood watching. I reached out instinctively and pressed my palm against the monitor glass. It was freezing, painfully so, and yet, beneath the frost, I could feel another surface pressing back. When I pulled my hand away, the frost on the screen bore the outline of my palm. The figure on the screen began to move again, slowly turning her head, not toward the corridor, but toward the camera. Her eyes, my eyes, were blank with frost. The screens went dark. I awoke several hours later in my office, the surveillance room empty, the tape gone. My hand ached with frostbite beneath the skin. No one mentioned the incident. Chen Wei was reassigned the following week to external operations. His records in the personnel index were sealed, his name erased from the access logs. The winter sections remain at -5 degrees. When maintenance staff pass through, their shifts are logged with 17-minute intervals of silence. The official explanation: sensor interference due to temperature variance. I continued my cataloging, though I now avoid any documents with red ribbon or wax seals. Yet sometimes, when I lean too close to the parchment light, I see faint moisture curling along the edge of the paper, as if something within the fibers were breathing. It is October now, 2 months until December 17, 2024. The temperature monitor beside my desk reads -3 degrees, and this morning, when I logged into the archive system, I found a new file waiting in the digital directory, unlabeled, time-stamped exactly 2 months from today, and marked with a single note in the metadata for Beatrice Romano. They told me the Vatican grottos were built only for rest. No one mentioned that some graves had been opened before. My name is Father Matteo Silva, and for 21 years I have served the Holy See in its most silent office, the Custodia Funeraria, the custodians of the dead. We are not widely spoken of, nor are we listed among the Vatican's departments. Our duty is simple. We prepare, bless, and inter the remains of clergy and dignitaries in the subterranean vaults beneath St. Peter's Basilica. We sign no papers, leave no photographs, and write no names beyond the marble plates. Each burial follows the same sacred sequence, known internally as Ordo Sepulchri. It begins with a candle lit at the north pillar, a symbol of the soul's ascent, followed by a prayer whispered in Latin thrice over the closed coffin. The final act is sealing the lid with Vatican wax pressed by a copper stamp bearing the fisherman's ring. I have done this hundreds of times, and I thought myself immune to wonder or dread. That changed in the spring of 2023, when I was asked to conduct what they called a private reinterment. The file was handed to me by Monsignor Rega of the Secretariat, bound in a plain red ribbon. The name on the first page read, Father Auguste Lemieux, Missionary Diocese of St. Boniface, Manitoba, deceased 1891. There was no cause of death, no family contact, only a terse note, returned from overseas, interment, previously registered. Previously registered. That phrase stayed with me. It meant the man had already been buried once. The grottos beneath St. Peter's are older than most know, older even than the basilica above. They smell of limestone and beeswax, and the silence there feels heavy, as if the air itself refuses to echo. I was accompanied by a deacon and 2 lay custodians. The coffin was already waiting in the preparation chamber, unmarked pine, bound with iron nails, its surface pitted by age. The tag affixed to the corner read simply, Repatriated Remains. Protocol required we verify the body before sealing, so I lifted the lid. What I found inside was not a man. Arranged with unsettling precision were the bones of several small animals, a dog, a lamb, perhaps a bird, assembled crudely into human shape. The skull had been fashioned from plaster, painted in the likeness of a face, now flaked and hollow, and on the inside of the coffin lid, faint but unmistakable, were scratches, dozens of them, arcing in desperate crescents, as though something had clawed to get out. The deacon gasped and crossed himself. I simply closed the lid again. I documented everything as required, sealing the chamber log with the Vatican crest. But the deeper unease did not come from what I saw. It came from the second file I was handed that evening. A sealed envelope, crimson ribbon intact, marked with my initials. Inside was a folded parchment stamped Secretum Funebris. I was to transfer Father Lemieux's remains, the real remains, I was told, from the first interment chamber below the basilica. The chamber, according to our archives, had been sealed since 1891. No one had authorization to enter since. At 3:17 in the morning, the hour reserved for silent prayers of the dead, I descended alone into the lower vaults. The passage narrowed into rock corridors, where candles burned only in glass alcoves. The key Rega had given me was copper, tarnished green. It turned with surprising ease in the ancient lock. Inside, the chamber held a single coffin, white oak, still intact, resting upon a raised slab. The wax seal bore the imprint of the fisherman's ring, unbroken. Yet the air inside the room felt strangely warm, as if someone had only just left. The record required that I confirm identity before exhumation. With reluctance, I broke the seal and lifted the lid. There he was, a man in clerical vestments, hands folded, face serene, skin darkened but preserved, as if the decades had refused to claim him. The tag stitched inside the collar bore his name, Pater Auguste Lemieux. So he had indeed been buried once. But as I leaned closer, I noticed something the file had not mentioned. Beneath his nails, clean, ivory, and uncut, were small crescents of wax, the same Vatican wax used for sealing coffins, and there were teeth marks in the lining of the shroud, faint but real. It was then that I heard it, a slow, rhythmic sound, almost too faint to perceive. A knock, then another, coming from beneath the slab. I froze. The candle guttered. And for the first time in years, I prayed not in Latin, but in my own trembling voice. The sound stopped only when I whispered, Requiem aeternam dona e Domai. I resealed the coffin. But before I left, I noticed something else, etched into the inside of the chamber door. In old script were the words, Non est idem, he is not the same. That morning, I returned to the archive office to finalize the report. Monsignor Riga was absent, his desk already cleared. In his place sat a single sealed document, tied again with the same crimson ribbon. The tag read, Custodia Funeraria, Father Matteo Silva. The instructions were written in Latin. They ordered me to catalog a supplement mortis, a death supplement record, reserved for clerics whose burial required amendment. The parchment was yellowed, the ink fading. Yet, as I unrolled it under the archival lamp, I noticed faint impressions surfacing beneath the old script, as though another text was hidden beneath. At first, it was only a shimmer, a pattern like veins beneath skin. But as I watched, the letters began to darken, rising through the ink like blood through water. I read them aloud before I understood what they meant. Matteo Silva, interment scheduled 11 April 2023. My name. My date, the day of Father Lemieux's second burial. I sat back, heart hammering. The words continued to shift, as if written by an invisible hand. Beneath my name, a new line appeared. What we bury twice must rise once. Then the lamp flickered and went out. When I turned it back on, the parchment was blank again. Only the faint trace of the red ribbon remained on the table, as if it had burned itself into the wood. That evening, I was called to the grotto once more. The deacon who had assisted me earlier had not reported for duty. His quarters were empty, his robes neatly folded. I went down alone, though every instinct warned me not to. The chamber was colder this time. The newly interred coffin of Father Lemieux stood beside the older one, twin caskets, side by side. But the wax seal I had pressed only hours earlier was already broken. Inside, the coffin was empty, and on the slab between the two boxes was a single folded note, written in a hand I recognized as my own. He was already buried once. Finish what you began. Then I saw it. Faint scratches on the inside of the second coffin's lid. Human. And beneath them, pressed into the lining, a fragment of skin, no larger than a coin. I touched it. It was warm. I never filed the burial report. The Secretariat listed the reinterment as complete, and my name was reassigned to the Congregation for the Causes of Saints, a convenient way to remove me from the grottos. No one mentioned the deacon again. Some nights, however, I still wake at 3:17, the hour of his prayer. I hear faint knocking beneath my floor, measured and patient. When I check the archive room, the document with the red ribbon is gone, but the wax stamp lies in my drawer, newly used, the copper still warm. I have come to understand that in the Vatican, not all burials are meant to rest. Some are meant to be watched, some to be remembered, and a few, like Father Lemieux's, are meant to be shared. Tomorrow, I have been asked to assist in another private reinterment. The file was delivered this morning. The name written on the tag is familiar, Father Mateo Silva, and for the first time in my life, I have refused to light the north pillar candle because I know now what it means to bury something twice. In the secret archives, every document has its hunger. Some crave touch, others crave silence, but the one they gave to Samuel Okonkwo, I believe, consumed light itself. My name is Beatrice Romano, archivist of Section Delta, responsible for cataloging sealed documents from the late 16th century. Our work is procedural, almost liturgical. We obey the cataloging rules as if they were commandments. Never unseal without two witnesses, never read aloud in solitude, and always record under consistent candlelight. Light is our constant companion in that place. The electric bulbs hum faintly above the rows of vellum and iron chests, but even they are dim by design, preserving centuries of sacred ink. Candles, however, are reserved for what we call the unlit texts, manuscripts that resist electric light, where ink becomes legible only beneath flame. Samuel Okonkwo joined our team 3 months ago, a quiet man from the Nigerian diocese, meticulous and reverent. He'd been assigned to the Liber Fame Sancta, translated, the Book of Holy Hunger. The record described it as a fasting manual for monastic communities in the mid-1500s. But I remember the warning written in the inventory margins. Requires 2 candles minimum. One renders text invisible. We took it as superstition, until it stopped being that. Every evening, when I passed Samuel's desk on my way to storage, I saw the double flame reflected in his glasses. Yet behind him, his shadow seemed thinner than before. It barely reached his chair legs, even when the light stood directly behind him. I began noticing small violations in protocol, nothing severe, but enough to mark unease. Samuel had started keeping the Liber Fame Sancta open past curfew. The archive is to be sealed at 10 o'clock sharp, but on 3 occasions, I found the registry light burning after hours. When I confronted him gently, he smiled and said, "The text changes when no one watches." I assumed he meant illumination from heat expansion or oil seepage. Old vellum behaves strangely. But one night, he showed me. Under twin candles, the script bloomed in brown-red ink, curling letters like tendrils. But when I leaned forward, one of the flames flickered from my breath, and half the words vanished. The remaining line read, "They shall fast from the flesh of bread and feast upon the flesh of shadow." I reached instinctively to steady the candle, but Samuel stopped me. "Don't," he said. "The manuscript doesn't like when you touch the flame." His voice trembled, not with fear, but reverence. He traced the faded Latin with his gloved finger and whispered, "They believed sanctity could be consumed." In the following weeks, I noticed the room darker than before, as though each evening stole a degree of brightness. Candles burned faster near his desk. The brass holders turned black with soot, despite fresh wicks. Then one morning, I found a slip of parchment tucked beneath my register. It wasn't in my handwriting. It simply read, Archivist Romano, 2 candles are not enough. Light behaves predictably in the archives, except when it doesn't. The night of March the 15th, 2023, I returned for a forgotten ledger. The guard had already locked the upper corridor, so I entered through the secondary stairwell. It was nearly silent below, the air thick with candle wax and dust. Yet as I descended, I heard faint chanting, Latin phrases murmured in cadence, as though recited from memory. I followed the sound to Samuel's desk. The Liber Fame Sancta lay open, though no candles burned nearby. Still, faint script glimmered on the page, as if drawn in moonlight. Samuel, I whispered. He didn't look up. His face was turned toward the manuscript, expression slack, lips moving slowly. The words he spoke were not in Latin. I recognized, but something close, a monastic dialect perhaps, or a corrupted vow. When I approached, the candle on the far shelf flared violently, throwing light across the room. And for a fraction of a second, I saw his shadow stretch across the wall, thin, trembling, and wrong. It did not match his movements. I stepped closer, heart racing. His shadow leaned toward the book while he sat motionless. Then I saw it. The manuscript's margins darkened as the candlelight touched them, as though drinking in the glow. The flame sputtered, shrank, and died. Samuel, I said firmly, touching his shoulder. He blinked, eyes dry, unseeing for a moment. Then softly, I think it's fasting again. He smiled faintly, like a man at peace, and closed the book. But the darkness that followed was absolute. We had to light 2 new candles before we could find the door. The next morning, the archivist on shift reported his absence. His desk was empty, except for the Liber Fame Sancta, sealed in red ribbon. No one had permission to reseal it. Protocol demanded we log every anomaly, so I volunteered to inspect. I lit 2 candles, as required. The seal looked fresh, wax still pliant, impression unbroken. But beneath the ribbon, faint letters had bled through the vellum cover. Illuminare is consumer. To illuminate is to consume. I broke the seal and opened the first page. The ink shimmered faintly, feeding on the twin flames beside me. Then between the lines of Latin, newer letters surfaced, black and trembling like veins in water. They formed my name, Beatrice Romano, Archivist of Light, dated the 24th of March, 2023. That was 3 days away. The candle, to my left, hissed, guttered low. I turned slightly to shield it from the draft, and when I looked back, the right-hand flame had vanished entirely. The manuscript grew pale and blank before my eyes. For one terrible second, I thought I saw my own reflection in the vellum's faint gloss, but it was darker, thinner, drawn in shadow. My outline leaned forward even as I sat still. Then a whisper, soft, almost kind, rose from the parchment. Hunger is devotion. I reached for the second candle, desperate to keep it alive, but the wax collapsed inward, wick sputtering. The last light dissolved into smoke. Darkness settled thick as oil. And yet, across the desk, the manuscript glowed faintly, letters carved in darkness, visible only because they devoured the absence of light. In that radiance, I saw Samuel's silhouette kneeling behind the desk, head bowed toward the book. His body was gone, reduced to a contour of moving shadow. When he raised his face, there were no features, only black, rippling depth. He opened his mouth, but no sound came, only the slow extinguishing of what little light remained. When I woke, the candles were unlit, but untouched. The Liber Fames Sancta was closed. I was lying on the cold floor, my shadow misaligned with the angle of the lamps above. It reached barely to my knees. The official report lists Samuel Okonkwo as reassigned indefinitely. The phrase always means the same thing here. Gone, without ceremony. His section has been resealed, and the Liber Fames Sancta placed back into deep containment, marked illuminated consumption, restricted viewing. I resumed my duties, though something is different now. My office feels darker, even under full light. When I walk the corridors, the candles seem to bend inward, their flames drawn toward me. This morning, I received a small envelope, unsigned, slid beneath my door. Inside was a slip of vellum torn from a larger sheet. Faint words, familiar in texture, surfaced beneath the ink as I tilted it toward the sun. Archivist Romano, one candle left. I turned to look at the window. The daylight outside seemed weaker than before. My shadow on the floor did not move as I did, and yet, when I leaned closer to the light to read again, I could swear I saw the faint outline of a book reflected in the glass, its pages turned by themselves. There is a rule in the Archivum Secretum. No sound should come from a sealed tower, but on my 7th night shift, I heard a bell ringing, not outward, but inward, as if the air itself were being drawn into its mouth. My name is Beatrice Romano, Vatican Archivist, Office of Restricted Records, Lower Wing 14. I was assigned to night cataloging duty in the winter of 2021, assisting with the reclassification of unverified relic documentation. It was a task of quiet dignity, long hours spent under the amber glow of lamps, the air heavy with the smell of vellum, dust, and candle wax. Our work followed strict order. Each folder bore a color code, blue for open record, green for ongoing verification, and red for containment. Red documents were never to be opened unless directly authorized by the Custos Sigillorum himself. We were taught that red meant the record was sealed, not for secrecy, but for mercy. The eastern tower, visible through the narrow windows of Wing 14, had been closed since the late 19th century. Its door was welded shut after a collapse, and no record of its contents survived. The older guards still crossed themselves when passing near its base. I kept my distance from superstition. My faith was academic, procedural, the kind built from the measured reverence of ink and parchment. I lived simply, work, vespers, dinner, then sleep in the small dormitory above the lower archive. Until I began skipping dinner. It started with exhaustion. I told myself I'd eat later, after finishing one more shelf, one more index. The silence of the archives at night felt almost comforting, until that silence began to move. At first it was subtle, a faint recoil in the air, a pressure behind the ears, and then distantly, a bell tolling from the east. The first night it happened, I assumed it was my imagination, an echo from the nearby basilica, perhaps. But the sound was wrong. Each chime didn't ring outward, as bells are meant to. It seemed to inhale the air around it, drawing sound into itself. The flame of my lamp bent slightly toward the window with each note, as though caught in a slow, steady breath. When I mentioned it to the night custodian, Sister Agnes Kowalski, She paused longer than necessary before answering. "That tower," she said, lowering her eyes. "You must not mind it. It has been sealed since before my vows." I laughed it off, lightly, politely. But that night, when the tolling returned, I counted 12 rings, then 11, then 10. Each subsequent night, it rang one fewer time, as though it were ringing backward through some hidden hour. By the 5th night, I stopped trying to ignore it. I began checking the archives for references to the Eastern Tower. Few remained. One incomplete inventory mentioned a campana vocantis calling bell, commissioned in the year 1879. No description, only a note. Cast for reclamation rights, Canada Mission. I filed a request for clarification. No reply came. And then, on the 8th night, while cataloging a sealed dossier marked with a red ribbon, I saw the faint outline of letters surfacing beneath the top layer of ink. I adjusted my lamp and read Romano Beatrice, February 6, 2022. The ink sank again before I could verify it, leaving only clean parchment behind. Sister Agnes stopped reporting for duty after that night. Her room was found empty, her key left neatly on her desk. No transfer notice was filed. By now the bell had begun to toll earlier, at exactly 3:17 am, time often cited in our procedural logs as hora mortis custodita, the guarded hour of death. I would feel it before I heard it, the tightening of air, the flicker of candles drawing inward, then the sound, soft, deliberate, each note heavier than the last. I followed its pull one night, against protocol, carrying only a lantern and the copper key that unlocked the sub-hall below the east transept. The corridor descended steeply. At its end, a blackened gate barred the base of the tower, its iron cross warped with age. When I pressed my ear to the metal, the next toll shuddered through it, not as sound, but as a deep inhalation, dragging the warmth from my skin. Inside, I thought I heard something else, a faint voice reciting the opening of the Requiem Mass in Latin. The words were reversed, fragmented, miserere nobis, unraveling into unintelligible echoes. I reported this to the Office of Preservation the following morning. They thanked me for my diligence and reminded me that the tower is not your concern. I was reassigned to catalog sealed correspondences from the North American missions, a task, I suspect, chosen with purpose. Among those letters, I found one bearing the same red ribbon as the document that had shown my name. It was dated 1882 and addressed from a mission near Fort Providence, Canada. The priest's name was Father Thaddeus Morel. His final entry read, "If I do not return by spring, tell the foundry the bell must be turned against its own voice." It was meant to call me home, but it listens now for others. I could not breathe after reading that line. The letter bore a faint watermark, an impression of concentric rings, like ripples from a struck bell. The next night, the bell began to toll earlier than ever. Midnight. 11 chimes. 10, 9. The air rippled inward, bending the flame of every candle toward the east. The parchment on my desk began to rustle, as if caught in a silent wind. I left my post again, walking barefoot down the marble corridor, the lantern trembling in my hand. The closer I came to the eastern tower, the heavier the air grew, dense, saturated, like the pause before an inhale. The gate stood open. No one had touched that lock in over a century, yet the hinges were cold, not rusted. I stepped inside. The chamber beyond was circular, lined with scaffolding and rotted wood. At its center hung a massive bell, dark green with age. But instead of the usual Latin dedication, the inscription spiraled inward, letters narrowing toward the center, as though the words themselves were collapsing. The final line read, Vocat qui obit, he calls who departs. The bell swung faintly, though no wind moved. With each arc, it inhaled. Papers at my side lifted toward it. The air from my lungs seemed to follow. In the curve of its metal, I saw something. Not my reflection, but someone walking toward me from within, as though the bell's surface were a window to another place. He wore a clerical coat, soaked in snow. His lips moved, but the words came backward, drawn through the tolling. I realized then that the bell wasn't summoning anything from the world beyond. It was calling backward, through time, reclaiming the sound of its own creation, and with it, the name of its next listener. I tried to flee, but the air clung to me, like water. My lantern flickered and inverted, the flame curling down instead of up. The figure within the bell raised a trembling hand and pressed it against the inside of the metal. The outline of his palm burned through, black against the bronze. I recognized the shape immediately. It matched the smudge on the parchment, where my name had once surfaced. The next hole struck. My vision folded inward, soundless, collapsing. The last thing I heard was my own breath being drawn away, piece by piece, into the waiting mouth of the bell. They found me hours later, unconscious, near the tower gate. No trace of the bell remained inside. Only a hollow space, as if the metal had never existed. The welds at the entrance were restored the next day. My superiors recorded it as an episode of fatigue and misinterpretation of archival data. I was given medical leave and instructed not to speak of the incident. Back in my quarters, I found a new document waiting on my desk, unsealed, unmarked. It contained a single date written in red ink, February 6th, 2022, and beneath it, faintly embossed in the paper, the concentric rings of a bell. Every night since, I've listened closely for the hour of 3:17. The air no longer trembles. Not yet, but sometimes, when I breathe in too deeply, I swear I can feel the echo of that inverted sound, a tolling that does not end, drawing something small and warm out of me and back into the dark. There is a room in the apostolic guest wing that has not been occupied for over 250 years, and yet, every winter, its firewood is replaced, its salt is refreshed, and the key is kept warm in the porter's hand. My name is Nina Volkov, and I serve as an archivist in the Vatican Apostolic Library, specializing in the classification of guest registries and travel ledgers, dating from the 17th century onward. My work is not glamorous. It is clerical, procedural, and in most cases, utterly devoid of mystery. I was assigned to the old guest wing, a section closed to visitors since the mid-19th century. The rooms there are preserved for research purposes, a living record of ecclesiastical hospitality. I was to compare handwritten ledgers against scanned indices and correct inconsistencies in our database. On my second week, I noticed a recurring entry, identical each year. Father Dubois, Room 12, East Wing, reserved for winter months. Upon his return from the mission, the handwriting changed across centuries, but the note never did. The reservation was made every single year since 1767. Always in December. Always confirmed. Always left blank under arrival date. At first, I thought it a clerical tradition, some symbolic entry to honor a long-lost missionary. But when I cross-referenced the registry, I found something odd. Room 12 still exists. And not merely exists, it is still prepared. The logs for the domestic staff, modern ones, signed digitally by the current custodian, listed the same duties each winter. Firewood stacked beside the hearth. Fresh salt placed in a wooden bowl on the mantel. Linens changed on December 3rd, candle replaced on December 6th. No guest was ever recorded as having stayed. Yet these tasks have been performed every year without fail. When I asked Brother Matthias, the night porter responsible for the eastern wing, he simply said, "That room is kept in readiness." "For whom?" I asked. He looked uncomfortable. "For Father Dubois." Upon his return. That was all. He said it with the practiced neutrality of someone repeating a policy he didn't understand, and perhaps didn't want to. It was mid-January, cold and dry, when the anomaly deepened. That night, the library's heating system faltered, and I volunteered to stay late to finish cataloging a small trunk of guest correspondence. The old guest wing was closer to the backup generator, and I decided to relocate there for warmth. The corridor lights in that wing are faint, aged bulbs behind frosted glass, giving off a tired yellow glow. Every sound carried: my footsteps, the hum of radiators, the soft brush of dust falling from beams. Room 12 was easy to find, a brass number plate, dulled by time. A wooden door of darker varnish than its neighbors. The keyhole was wide enough to peer through. Inside, I could make out a glow, the flicker of firelight. Someone had lit the hearth. I froze, unsure whether to report it or investigate. No one should have been there. The wing was restricted to staff and researchers by day and sealed by night. Yet through the keyhole I saw unmistakable movement, the shimmer of heat, the orange pulse of an active flame. I called out softly, "Is anyone inside?" No answer. I tried the knob. It turned, but only part way, as though held by resistance from within. I let go at once. A strange, cold air seemed to seep through the crack, smelling faintly of burned salt. When I returned to the porter's desk, Brother Matthias looked up from his ledger. I asked who had lit room 12's fireplace. He didn't answer right away. Then slowly, the fire lights itself when the guest arrives. I thought he was joking, but his eyes were steady. He took out a key ring, removed a small iron key, and placed it on the desk between us. "Do not enter unless you are summoned." I asked what that meant. He said, "You will know." Over the next several days, I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Faulty wiring, a reflection, perhaps someone performing maintenance. Still, unease lingered. The corridor near room 12 seemed always a degree colder than the rest of the building, no matter the heating schedule. During a late-night inventory session, I came across a sealed document bound in red ribbon. It bore a wax stamp from the year 1767, the same year Father Dubois' reservation first appeared. It was labeled in Latin, Pro Memoria Missionis Dubois. For the memory of Dubois' mission, it had never been catalogued. According to protocol, sealed documents of this kind were to be registered before opening, but curiosity overtook me. The ribbon came loose too easily, as if it had been untied many times before. Inside was a single sheet of parchment, blank at first glance. But as I held it under the desk lamp, faint letters began to surface beneath the ink, like something emerging from deep water. They formed my name, Archivist Nina Volkov, followed by a date, February 10th, 2025. I stared at it for a long time. The ink shimmered faintly, then receded, leaving the parchment pale and innocent again. That night, I left the archives early, but as I passed through the east corridor, I noticed a light spilling from beneath the door of room 12 again. The faint scent of salt and ash followed me all the way down the stairs. The following week, the date from the parchment drew near. On the evening of February 9th, the Vatican Library closed early due to maintenance on the upper floors. I was alone in the East Wing, tasked with finalizing a digital log. It was snowing outside, the flakes heavy and silent against the windows. When the clock struck 3:17, and sit, a familiar sound echoed down the corridor, a soft knock, rhythmic, deliberate, on a door that should have been empty. Room 12. I froze. Then, against all sense, I went to it. The fire inside was already burning. I could see the glow even before I reached the door. The handle was warm, the air around it dry and metallic. I called out again, "Father Dubois." A pause, then a voice, soft, steady in old French, answered from within. At last, someone remembers. I stepped back. My heart felt locked in my throat. I was told this room was reserved. I managed, for my return, the voice said. And so I have. There was a sound then like the shift of wood under weight. I could almost see a shadow moving behind the keyhole. The mission is finished. The voice continued, quieter now. The record must be sealed. I said nothing. Will you witness it? I did not answer. Then, with a slow scrape, the door opened a fraction, enough to let a line of heat and light spill out, bright and trembling. Inside, the fireplace burned high, but no figure sat before it. Only a chair, empty, its cushion sunken, as if someone invisible rested there. On the table beside it lay a small bound volume, the guest registry for the current year, already open to a page. I could see an entry written there, in fresh ink. Father Dubois, room 12, East Wing, checked in, February 10th, 2025. The clock on the mantel clicked over. Midnight became the 10th. I watched, unable to move, as the pen lying beside the open page lifted slightly, wrote a final note in perfect cursive, and then settled again. Witness, Nina Volkov. My hand went cold. The fire began to dim, the orange light retreating until the room was dark again. When I blinked, the chair was empty. The registry closed. Only the faint trace of salt on the floor remained, drawn in a thin circle around the hearth. I turned to leave, but before I reached the corridor, the voice spoke one last time, right beside my ear. You have kept the room well. I told no one, not Brother Matthias, not the prefect, not even the senior archivists. The event would have been dismissed as exhaustion or imagination. Still, every year since, the winter roster has included my name among the assigned maintainers of the East Wing. My duties are clear. Replace the salt, restock the firewood, and ensure room 12 remains ready. This December, I performed the task myself. The air inside the room was calm, faintly warm, as though the fire had only just gone out. On the mantel, I found the guest ledger open to the newest year. Beneath Father Dubois's entry, another line had been added. Archivist Nina Volkov, upon her return, and below it, in handwriting not my own, witness Beatrice Romano. There are nights in the chapel when the air feels too still, too clean, as if God himself has stepped outside to watch from the cold. My name is Father Antonio Guerrero. I was assigned to the Basilica of St. Anselm in the year 2024, a modest church tucked behind the Vatican's east walls, known more for its silence than its visitors. My duties were simple and sacred: to oversee Eucharistic adoration during the night hours, when few priests volunteered to remain awake. I have always cherished those vigils, the candlelight trembling before the tabernacle, the faint sound of the radiator humming, and the rhythm of whispered prayers offered to an empty chapel. The silence, when pure, is a kind of devotion. Our adoration rota was strict. From midnight to 3 in the morning, the host must not be left unattended. The priest on duty kneels or sits before it, reading quietly or offering prayer. No phone, no distraction, no sleep. The rule was old, older than St. Anselm itself. Keep vigil. Keep warm. The sacristan would always remind us before leaving. The chapel itself was small: arched ceilings, polished marble floors, and an ornate golden tabernacle centered beneath a carving of the crucifixion. 2 candles burned perpetually before it, replaced each morning by the novices. I knew every sound the chapel made: the wood creaking when the wind shifted, the faint clink of the censer, the rustle of my own robes. It was during one of these vigils in early November that I noticed it, the first sign that something in that silence was not entirely holy. At 2:17 am, in rose to adjust the candles, the air, which had been comfortably warm moments before, bit at my hands like winter. My breath fogged faintly before me. The radiator still whispered in the corner, steady and alive. When I opened the tabernacle door to replace the small candle inside, I froze. The golden ciborium, the vessel containing the consecrated hosts, was coated with a fine crust of frost. Tiny crystals clung to the rim and glittered like stars in the candlelight. I touched the surface. It burned with cold. I stepped back, heart pounding. My first thought was mechanical failure. The Vatican heating systems were meticulous, regulated even for small chapels. But the air was still warm behind me. Only the tabernacle, only the host, seemed marked by the frost. I recorded the anomaly in the nightly logbook as required. 2:17 am, cold presence inside tabernacle. Possible ventilation issue. Will inspect tomorrow. I closed the door, genuflected, and resumed my place. But the silence felt altered now, dense, listening. The candlelight wavered, as if something unseen had moved between me and the flame. I tried to pray. The words felt heavy in my throat, like breath frozen in glass. The next morning, I went to the maintenance office. Brother Corrado, the engineer responsible for the heating systems, looked over the logs. He was a patient man, practical and godly. "The system's fine," he said, frowning at the printout. Temperature never dropped below 22 degrees. Maybe the tabernacle metal caught a draft, but the rest of the room was warm. I insisted. He shrugged. St. Anselm's stones breathe strangely. Old buildings do that. I wanted to believe him. But that night, during my next vigil, the cold returned, stronger. At 1:38, I saw the frost forming again. This time, along the inner edge of the tabernacle door, tracing delicate white veins, like spider silk. It spread outward, reaching toward the marble altar. I stepped closer. The air within the tabernacle pulsed with chill, as if drawing heat from my skin. The host itself, when I looked closely, seemed to shimmer, just slightly, beneath the frost. A faint sound filled the silence. Not wind, not the hum of machinery. It was soft, rhythmic breathing. I closed the tabernacle slowly and whispered a prayer of reparation. The sound stopped instantly. When I finished my shift, I checked the archive records, hoping to find prior notes about temperature anomalies. Nothing recent. But deep in the digital catalog, I found a scan of a parchment dated 1723. It was labeled Sacristan's Notes, Winter Liturgy. The final line read, "Some hungers follow the host itself. Keep vigil. Keep warm." The ink had bled faintly, as if once soaked in condensation. That night, I brought an extra candle to the chapel. Then another and another. By 3 in the morning, 8 flames burned before the tabernacle, yet the air around it remained bitterly cold, while my own skin glistened with sweat from the warmth beyond. Something was feeding on the warmth, I thought. Something that did not want to be forgotten. By the end of the week, the frost began appearing during the day. The sacristan, an elderly nun named Sister Marta, complained that her hands ached like January when she polished the tabernacle. She asked me quietly, "Father, is there something wrong with the altar?" I told her it was nothing. A ventilation problem, perhaps. But her eyes lingered on the gold door longer than usual. "Then why does it breathe, Father?" That night, I stayed beyond my assigned hours. The chapel was silent, except for the faint ticking of the wall clock. I did not open the tabernacle, only knelt before it. The frost glowed faintly, illuminated by candlelight. At 2:40, the frost began to recede, melting not outward, but inward, as if drawn back into the ciborium itself. I felt a pressure against my chest, like standing near a deep well that pulls the air down. Then I heard it again, breathing. But this time, it came from inside the tabernacle, shallow, slow, steady. I forced myself to remain kneeling. My hands shook. "Corpus Christi," I whispered. The frost spread outward again, as if in response, tracing the edges of the altar cloth. I could see my own breath clouding in the candlelight, though the flame did not flicker. At 3:17 exactly, the bell in the hallway tolled once, though it was not scheduled to ring until morning prayers. The air shifted. Something unseen passed behind me. The candles bent backward toward the pews, their flames all leaning as one. When I turned, the chapel door stood slightly ajar. Frost rimmed its handle. I did not move until the dawn light crept through the stained glass. When it touched the tabernacle, the frost vanished as if it had never been. I reported the incident to my superior, Monsignor Darko, who listened without expression. When I mentioned the breathing, he lowered his eyes. "You will say nothing further of this, Father Guerrero," he said. "Do you understand?" I nodded, though my voice failed me. That night, I was reassigned temporarily to review sealed liturgical documents from the Basilica archives, a task I accepted with quiet relief. The chamber was colder, yes, but at least I was away from the tabernacle. On the second night of cataloging, I encountered a folder sealed with red ribbon and a wax crest marked Anselm, 1723. When I opened it, a faint smell of incense and old air escaped. Inside were letters exchanged between the sacristan and a visiting theologian. They spoke of a winter that would not leave the host, and a hunger older than man's worship. One page, partly burned, bore a list of names, each marked with a date. At the bottom of the final sheet, faint letters began surfacing beneath the ink, as though drawn upward by moisture. My name, and below it, a date I have not yet lived. I dropped the parchment. Frost bloomed instantly across the tabletop, spreading toward my hands. I stumbled back, heart hammering. From the hallway came a low metallic sound, like a tabernacle door closing. I turned toward the chapel entrance. It was open, though I had locked it myself. Candlelight flickered within, weak and blue, drawn by something deeper than fear. I stepped inside. The air was arctic, thick with the smell of myrrh. The tabernacle door hung wide. Frost billowed from within like breath in winter. On the altar cloth lay the ciborium, its lid displaced, its rim edged with ice. The hosts inside shone faintly in the dim light, as though giving off their own glow. And there, in the reflection of the gold, I saw a figure kneeling opposite me. It looked like a priest, head bowed, hands clasped. But there was no face, only a faint distortion in the cold air, a shape carved from frost and silence. Its breath clouded the golden surface. Then I heard my own voice whisper back from that reflection, "Keep vigil, keep warm." The candles extinguished all at once. Only the frost remained, glimmering faintly in the darkness, like a mouth forming words I could not hear. The next morning, the chapel was sealed for structural repair. No one asked for my statement. No one mentioned the missing ciborium, though I saw the empty space where it had rested. Monsignor Darko reassigned me to the archives permanently. My new office is beneath the basilica, near the climate-controlled vaults, where ancient documents are kept in perfect cold. I try not to think about the temperature here, or how it never seems to rise. Some nights, when I open a sealed file, frost will gather faintly on my fingertips. The words on the parchment sometimes shimmer, as if breathing. And lately, in the silence between hours, I hear a sound echo through the metal shelves, soft, slow, reverent. Breathing. I have learned not to turn toward it, because I know now that the hunger which follows the host does not fade. It only waits, patient, watchful, for warmth. There is a rule among Vatican archivists that we are never to open a confession twice. Once read, the sin belongs to God alone. I broke that rule 3 weeks ago. My name is Beatrice Romano, Senior Archivist for the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith. My work concerns digital conversion of historical records, confessional transcriptions, missionary reports, private correspondences between clergy scattered across the former colonies of North America. The process is slow, reverent. Each page must be scanned, its ink stabilized, its marginal notes cataloged. We are not permitted to interpret the contents, only to preserve. The human hand is meant to be invisible in these halls. The material I had been assigned came from a missionary outpost called Saint Michel du Nord near the Great Lakes. Between the years of 1789 and 1843, dozens of priests had served there, hearing the confessions of explorers, trappers, and fur traders who worked the vast northern wilderness. Most of these records were routine: blasphemy, adultery, theft, the usual fatigues of isolated men living too far from civilization. But late in the index, I found a collection bound in gray parchment, its spine unmarked. Inside, each sheet carried the same seal, ad confession, in obscuro, reserved to the Holy See. The handwriting differed from page to page, but the phrase recorded at the top of every transcript was identical. "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned. I am afraid I will forget what food tastes like." It appeared 23 times. different hands, different priests, spanning nearly half a century. I felt a shiver, small, procedural, like static between ancient vellum and new gloves. In our training, we are told to note repetition, but not to dwell on it. Yet this phrase did not feel human. It carried no plea, no remorse, only dread, as if hunger itself were a confession. That evening, I logged the anomaly in the Vatican digital index and sent a quiet note to my supervisor, Monsignor Valenti. He replied only with, "Continue your work. Do not attempt cross-referencing at this stage," which of course meant that I immediately began to cross-reference. The confessions matched no known clerical numbering system. The penmanship was provincial French and English both, sometimes in the same paragraph. I discovered that all 23 confessors were registered as fur traders under the Hudson Bay Charter, but after the year of their confessions, not one appeared in census or burial records again. They had simply vanished. The workroom where I was stationed was buried deep in the apostolic archives, one floor below the climate-controlled section. It smelled faintly of glue, dust, and candle wax from the chapel above. At midnight, the air vents hummed softly, carrying the scent of old stone and something colder, metallic, like snow on iron. I often stayed late, not out of zeal, but because the silence of those hours made me feel like part of the architecture, one more hidden mechanism keeping memory alive. On the night it began, I was alone, except for the dim blue light of the scanning apparatus. The last confession of the evening came from a Father Henri Boucher, dated 1831. The ink was brown, faint, but legible. The penitent's name had been smudged out. Intentional redaction. I activated the ultraviolet filter and leaned closer. Beneath the obliterated name, faint letters began to surface, modern, precise, as if typed by machine. They spelled Beatrice Romano, and below that, a date I have not yet lived. I assumed a trick of light, perhaps contamination in the scanner glass. But when I switched the page to normal view, the letters remained, shimmering like condensation across the parchment. My pulse slowed, not quickened. In archives work, fear arrives like humidity, gradual, invisible, corroding confidence. I tried another scan, same result. Then a third, on a separate machine. The words did not vanish. At precisely 3:17 a. Mine. The lights in the corridor outside flickered. It happens sometimes when the dehumidifiers reset, yet I felt the hair on my arms rise. The silence deepened, acquiring weight. The parchment on the table seemed to breathe, not move exactly, but contract slightly, as though exhaling warmth. Then, faintly I heard it, a single knock from the old confessional booth at the end of the corridor. We keep that booth for ceremonial reasons only. It has not been used for decades. Its grille is sealed from the inside, and the door remains locked by decree. Still, the sound had been unmistakable, one solid rap, hollow and deliberate. I went to the corridor. The air was colder there. My shoes made soft echoes against the marble. The booth stood in shadow, beneath a red emergency lamp, its lattice glowing faintly like embered wood. As I watched, the lamp dimmed, then brightened again. "Is anyone there?" I asked, feeling foolish the instant the words left me. No answer, only a distant hiss, like wind across parchment. I returned to my station. The monitor showed a blank screen, though I had left the scan mid-process. The software had frozen. A new file had appeared in the session folder, untitled. When I opened it, The image was entirely black, except for a thin horizontal line of light near the bottom, like a horizon. I increased contrast. The line resolved into text, faint but precise. We came hungry, and we left without faces. My breath caught. I closed the document at once and disconnected the scanner. The entire archive seemed to pulse with a low-frequency hum, almost beneath hearing. I shut off the lights, leaving only the small votive candle by the exit door burning. Its flame stretched thin, as though pulled by unseen breath. That night I could not sleep. My apartment overlooked the piazza beside St. Peter's. Even with windows closed, I heard bells, not the usual sonorous peal, but something distant, metallic. Each ring seemed to echo the word forget. The next morning, I submitted a formal incident report, omitting my name's appearance, but noting the interference and duplication anomaly. Valenti summoned me to his office. He is an austere man, small of frame, his skin pale as the paper he guards. He listened without interruption, then leaned forward. "You saw your own name," he said. "Not a question. There may have been a data artifact," I replied carefully. He regarded me for a long moment, then opened a drawer and placed a small object on the desk, a copper key attached to a faded red ribbon. "This will open Cabinet 39, he said. "Section Obscura. Go alone. Take no scans. Read only the first page of what you find." I wanted to ask why, but he had already turned away to face the window, dismissing me. Cabinet 39 lay in the lower vaults, an area not on the modern maps, accessible only by service elevator. The copper key was cold in my hand, older than the lock it opened. The chamber beyond smelled of cedar and candle soot. There were no electric lights, only niches with oil lamps kept perpetually lit by unseen attendants. The silence felt ancient, the kind that devours footsteps before they fall. Inside the cabinet rested a bundle of parchment sealed with red wax. A label read, "Collectio Confessionum, Region Borealis, 1790, 1840. I broke the seal and unrolled the first document. It was not written by a priest, but by a security analyst, a layman attached to the missionary bureau. His name, David Park. The year, 1841. He wrote of a pattern discovered while reviewing confessional reports from the fur trading territories. 23 men had confessed the identical sin. Each described a fear of forgetting taste, of losing the memory of eating, though none appeared malnourished. He called it a contagion of appetite. Park's final paragraph was underlined 3 times. I fear the act of recording their words allows the hunger to move through ink. The priest's report dreams of chewing snow, of gnawing their own names. I request immediate sealing of all northern confessionals until the sound of knocking ceases. Beneath that, in a different hand, a Vatican official had added, "Approved containment by silence." The phrase chilled me, containment by silence, as though speech itself could invite what had been buried. I rolled the parchment closed, but something resisted, a faint pressure against my fingers. The paper felt warm, pulsing faintly. A drop of water, or something thicker, fell from the edge and struck my wrist. It smelled faintly of iron. I placed the scroll back and locked the cabinet, heart beating in slow, deliberate thuds. When I turned toward the door, I realized the lamps had dimmed. Only one remained lit, and its flame bent toward the far wall, drawn by some invisible draft. There, in the stone, was a door I had never seen, iron-bound, its hinges crusted with age. A Latin inscription above read, Non recorder, caro, do not let the flesh remember. A shiver crawled through me. This was not a door meant to be opened. Yet as I watched, I thought I saw frost form along its edges, and behind the metal, movement, not human movement, something slow, like the shifting of great roots in soil. I fled. The elevator seemed to take an eternity to rise. When I reached the upper archive, I found Valenti waiting beside my workstation. You read it, he said softly. Yes. Then you must finish it. He handed me another folder, sealed in red, labeled Park, Personal Record. His voice was steady, but his eyes were shadowed with exhaustion. Do not return to the lower vault. The rest will come to you. That night, I returned to my quarters, with the folder unopened. I sat at my small desk, listening to the city's distant murmur, at precisely 3:17 Ummer. But the same hour as before, the bells began again. One toll, then silence. I opened the folder. Inside was a final confession, undated, unsigned. The handwriting was meticulous, measured. Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned. I have eaten the memory of another man. His name was David Park. My throat tightened. I turned the page. There was more, notes written in different hands, as if multiple confessors had added to it. Over time, we tasted his hunger. He forgot our faces. Ink remembers more faithfully than flesh. Each line seemed freshly written, the ink glistening though the parchment was centuries old. As I watched, another sentence formed, slowly, letter by letter, as if written from beneath the page. You are next. The candle beside me hissed, its flame elongating to a sharp blue tip. My room darkened, except for that single unnatural light. I heard a sound like paper tearing underwater, followed by a faint, rhythmic knocking, 3 times from somewhere inside my walls. I looked at the folder again. The page was blank now. No ink, no words, only faint indentations where the phrases had been. My hands shook. I reached to close it when a smell filled the air, earthy animal, like wet fur drying by fire. And then, in the corner of my eye, movement, a figure, stood by the window, thin, indistinct, as though woven from smoke. Its face was not blank, but unfixed, shifting continually between features that almost made sense. A man, a priest, a reflection. It raised its hand and pressed something invisible to its mouth. Then, in a voice that seemed both within and behind me, it whispered the same words the traitors had confessed. I am afraid I will forget what food tastes like. The window glass fogged. When I blinked, the figure was gone, but on the condensation, written backward from the inside, were 2 words, confession accepted. I did not sleep. I sat until dawn, every shadow moving, as if with breath. When morning came, I returned to the archives, pale and trembling. Valenti met me at the door. You opened it, he said, without accusation. Yes, he nodded once, as though this had been expected. Then you must write it down. Every word, place it among the others. That is how we keep them contained. I asked, what are they? He looked at me then, not with fear, but with pity. Names that learn to eat, memory that devours itself. He turned away, leaving me standing alone in the corridor, the copper key still warm in my pocket. It has been 7 days since. Each night I hear faint scratching from the archive walls, as if the ink itself were trying to move. The candle at my desk grows longer instead of shorter. Sometimes, when I walk past the sealed confessional, I see frost blooming along its wooden grill. Once, I thought I heard breathing from inside, measured, hungry. I have done as instructed. I transcribed the events, cataloged them under Section Obscura, File 42, and sealed them with the same red ribbon. But I cannot shake the sense that the story is unfinished, that the ink is waiting for me to read it again. Last night, the parchment I first scanned reappeared on my desk. I had locked it away, yet there it was, pristine, smelling faintly of snow. The words beneath the ultraviolet light shifted once more. Not my name this time, yours, and below it, a new line being written. Even as I watched, I am afraid I will forget what food tastes like. The light flickered. Somewhere in the archive, the old confessional knocked 3 times, and the hunger, whatever it is, remembered my voice. I will seal this account tonight. If you are reading it, please, do not read it twice. Containment by silence is all that remains between memory and appetite. There is a rule in Section K. No one enters hungry. The body must be full, the spirit steady, and the room kept below freezing, because warmth wakes what is written there. And for 11 years, I have served as an archivist beneath the Apostolic Palace. I work among manuscripts that have never seen sunlight, under corridors where breath turns to frost long before prayer reaches heaven. When Chief Archivist Sophia Mercier was reassigned in late winter of 2023, the prefect himself asked if I would assume custodianship of Section K. It was not an honor I desired. Section K was infamous, even among those of us who spoke little. We called it the cellar that breathes. I was escorted there for the first time by 2 Swiss guards, each holding a copper lamp. The air grew colder with each descent, like walking into an unconfessed thought. The stairwell narrowed until it became a stone throat. There were no windows, no crucifix, only the metallic pulse of the temperature regulators echoing behind the walls. A bronze plaque outside the final gate read simply, Sectio K ADU Sum Internum, non superit ex 15 gratis. Inside, I found rows of glass-fronted cabinets glistening with frost, each labeled by decade. Faint vapor curled from their seals, and somewhere deep within the stacks, a soft crackling noise suggested paper stiffening under ice. An attendant named Brother Leon handed me a small manual bound in oilskin. He spoke quietly, like reciting a confession. Before entering, you must eat. Witnessed, documented. Your body must not hunger while you read. Those who starved remembered too much. He didn't elaborate. He only pointed toward a small adjoining room, a mess table, a loaf of bread, a bowl of lentils, a crucifix on the wall. The ritual was written in the manual. An archivist must consume a full serving of bread and broth before entry. A witness must sign the ledger to confirm. The act signifies fullness of body, so that what resides within does not mistake you for an empty vessel. I thought it ceremonial, a metaphor. That was before I noticed the frost-forming words across the metal door, Latin phrases that vanished as soon as I exhaled upon them. My first weeks in Section K passed in silence and careful routine. The shelves contained missionary testimonies from the Northern Territories, Greenland, Siberia, Canada, all written in the early 1800s, most describing prolonged isolation, starvation, and a peculiar spiritual derangement among the clergy there. The atmosphere was brutal. Every shift required heavy gloves and breathing masks to prevent condensation. The cold pressed itself into the joints like penance. Each evening, before closing, I verified that all documents were in their proper drawers. I extinguished my lamp. Then I ascended the staircase and locked the gate. That rhythm lasted until the 10th night. When I arrived the following morning, a single folder lay upon my desk in the entry vestibule. It was sealed with a red ribbon, a mark reserved for documents awaiting temperature-controlled shelving. No one else had clearance to handle such material. The surveillance logs were empty. The label read simply, Testimonia Missionarium, Northern Canada, Anno Domini 1847. But the parchment inside was wrong. The ink had not frozen. It bled faintly at the edges, as if still damp, and when I touched it, a small patch of frost retreated beneath my fingertip, revealing letters written beneath the visible text, letters that seemed to form the beginning of my name. BZA. I closed the folder immediately. My pulse was unsteady, though the cold should have numbed it. I reshelved the document, signed the ledger, and left. The next morning, it was back on my desk, unmarked, thawing. I reviewed the index for any reference to red-ribboned files misfiled from Section K, but there was none. I asked Brother Leon, who only crossed himself. They resurface sometimes, he murmured. Cold forgets, and paper remembers. Just reshelve it. Never read past the 4th line. His phrasing, never read past the 4th line, was written nowhere in the manual. I searched the margins for any update or codicil, but found only stains like frozen breath. That night, curiosity overcame obedience. Inside the folder lay a bundle of missionary reports, thin vellum sheets written in desperate, wavering Latin. Each was signed by a different priest, stationed among the northern settlements during a famine year. The first began, in the 12th week of Lent, our brethren began to starve. Father C suggested fasting as devotion, but by Easter only 2 of us could stand. The third did not die properly. He forgot how to swallow. We buried him beside the chapel, but the earth did not accept him. When we rose in the morning, he was seated among us again, mouth open, throat frozen. I stopped at the 4th line. My hands trembled. The ink had not faded over a century and a half. When I turned the page, frost bloomed across it, forming delicate filigree patterns like veins in marble. Beneath those veins, faint letters emerged, darker, newer, different handwriting. They formed a single phrase in Italian. Non aver fame, Beatrice. Do not be hungry, Beatrice. The edges of the parchment crackled softly, as though breathing. I resealed the folder and placed it back in cabinet 47B. Then I turned off the lamps and left. Outside the gate, I felt something impossible. A current of warm air brushing the back of my neck, carrying a faint smell of iron and incense, like altar rails left after Mass. 3 nights later, Section K's regulators failed. The temperature rose above 15 degrees for the first time in recorded history. The emergency sirens echoed faintly through the underground halls, followed by the hiss of deactivated compressors. By the time I arrived, a film of condensation covered every cabinet. The frost was melting. The manuscripts sweated. Brother Leon was already there, kneeling in prayer before the main shelf. The red ribbon folder lay open beside him, its parchment half unfurled. He looked up when I entered, his face pale with something more than cold. "It's waking," he whispered. "The words cannot survive warmth." He pressed the folder into my hands. "You must read it now. Finish it. Only the named can close it again." My name was visible now, fully written in the margin in a darker ink. Beatrice Romano, followed by a date that did not yet exist. March 17th, 2026. I should have reported the breach. I should have followed protocol. Instead, I read, the report continued, beyond the missionary's account. But the language had changed. The ink grew newer, the handwriting steadier, more modern. They sealed him in a stone vault beneath the chapel, believing cold would restrain him. But cold remembers. It spreads. It learns the shape of the vessels that enter its air. We feel it behind our eyes now, whispering for fullness, asking if we have eaten. We must never enter hungry, for hunger opens the throat, and what wears the priest's face waits only for that invitation. The letters shimmered faintly, as if heat bled from the page. A drop of water fell from the ceiling onto the parchment, and the ink beneath it vanished, replaced by something else, scrawled in fresh black script that appeared as I watched. "You have not eaten. Beatrice." I dropped the page. My breakfast lay untouched in the adjoining room. A sound rose behind me, a wet, deliberate swallow, echoing from somewhere deep among the shelves. Not a human voice, but an imitation, uncertain of rhythm. Then another, and another. The lamps flickered as the temperature continued to climb. Frost evaporated in tiny sighs. Cabinet doors clicked open on their own. From within, thin sheets of parchment fluttered and exhaled pale mist, as though the words themselves were trying to breathe. Brother Leon began reciting the Confiteor. His voice trembled, teeth chattering, not from cold but terror. I joined him instinctively, but halfway through the prayer, the air thickened, warm breath condensing against my face from behind. I turned. Through the misted glass of the nearest cabinet, I saw a reflection. It was my own face, but wrong. Mouth slightly parted, eyes unblinking, frost clinging to the lashes. The reflection raised its hand a moment after I did, not simultaneously but delayed, as if the glass had learned imitation. Its lips moved. No sound came, but I understood the words. "Feed it." The glass fogged completely. Behind it, something shifted, slow, jointed, paper thin. Brother Leon screamed, then a single abrupt sound that ended too soon. When I turned back, he was on the floor, eyes open, frost blooming from his throat outward like a halo. The air snapped cold again. Instantly, the compressors restarted on their own. The frost returned, sealing every cabinet shut in a flash of white. The folder in my hands refroze solid, trapping the ink mid-stroke. The last visible word was Beatrice. They found me hours later in the vestibule, still holding the sealed folder, my lips blue, but my pulse intact. The prefect ordered an inquiry. The temperature logs were corrupted. The security footage showed nothing beyond a white haze that filled the frame at exactly 3:17 APR. Mr. Brother Leon was pronounced dead of hypothermia. His final gesture, hands folded across his stomach, was interpreted as devotional, though I knew better. It was the ritual posture described in Procedure 3, a fullness of body. They replaced him quietly. Section K was resealed under stricter protocols. Now every morning, a junior attendant must witness me eat before I descend. They sign the ledger. I thank them. The archive remains below freezing. The hum of compressors is constant, like the heartbeat of something sleeping. And yet, each dawn when I arrive, there is always one folder waiting on my desk. Red ribbon. Frosted edges. Slowly thawing. I no longer open it, but sometimes, when the air grows too still, I hear the sound again, faint, deliberate, from within the walls. A swallow, uncertain and human. I pray it never learns hunger again, and I pray when the date written beside my name finally arrives, that the cold remembers mercy,